Welcome again, everybody. Great to see you all. We have the lovely Christine here today. We have the not so lovely myself, kind of lovely.
No, you're lovely. You're
Oh,
lovely as well. Don't
bless
talk
you,
yourself
friend.
down like that, Jared.
Sounded like fishing is what I did there.
Yeah, I
Okay,
know.
right
You
there.
compliment fishing. Yeah.
Today, dear listeners, we are going to talk about a subject that has no shortage of content and no shortage of media in the last 3 years. You know it, you've guessed it. This is our so acclaimed COVID cast. We are going to talk about the church and pandemics. So a little bit of how we've historically, as the church, dealt with sickness and illness, particularly of the pandemic variety. The approaches to vaccines that have been actually taking place historically, and then spend quite a bit of time talking about actually contemporarily what's going to be the engagement with the church around some of these ideas. We know already, as we actually mentioned this, that you're going to be, streaming ideas in your head about actually what kind of associations the church has. And it's why we've actually felt actually as a group of hosts, actually, this is a necessary topic to actually give some clarity to say, we think there are some things the church are doing well. We think there are a lot of things that the church could be doing better. So exactly why we want to actually talk about this today. So before we can do all that, we definitely need to roll through our intro. Why don't you take us away, Christine?
Two or Three Gathered is a series of conversations with Christian brothers and sisters, considering their efforts and contributions to the kingdom vocationally, their stories and testimonies of God's sovereignty and grace, and an opportunity to tackle the relevant issues the church faces in the 21st century.
In this, we seek to equip the saints by networking within the body, starting the conversation around often taboo subjects, and seeking to develop unity across Christian denominations and traditions by opening up discussion on worthy, necessary topics.
We want to help educate the wider body of Christ by asking experts and people of wisdom across multiple fields the hot button questions and sophisticated questions that we believe there are answers for in Christ Church, but that there is not necessarily always access to.
We want to further the growth of knowledge and wisdom in ourselves, to worship God with our minds and fellowship with all of you, as we collectively seek to discern what God-glorifying discipleship looks like for us in our respective vocations and in our spheres of influence.
It is our heart and hope that Christ himself would be in our midst as we converse about things we believe he himself is very interested in.
Welcome, twos and threes. Thanks for gathering with us. So starting us off today, I thought I would kick us off and actually just kind of go throughout history dynamic of this. Maybe it's actually, cold open, probably a warm open. You're pretty knowledgeable about a whole bunch of stuff, Christine. What's kind of your knowledge about like the church and like sickness throughout church history, not necessarily biblical history, church
right
history?
The church has always been at the forefront of helping people who are sick and needy, and so I know that during times of plague and famine and all sorts of like serious crises, the church has historically been at the forefront of that, working particularly with orphans of plague and things, taking people in, helping feed them. You have a lot of saints that are known for going out and into horrific situations and helping people who are struggling, and going into situations with lepers as well. Like the church was the place that set up kind of leper colonies when the rest of society hated lepers. So there is this historical tradition of care and concern for people who are very unwell, and almost a putting aside of care and concern for themselves, and going and looking after people who are sick. But there is also, I know that the church has always got two sides to it. There is also historical stuff around the church not behaving very well and turning people away and shutting their doors on sick people and things like that as well. So there is a kind of it's a bit iffy, and we look at the good stuff. You tend to look at the good stuff and go, "Isn't this amazing?" But the stories we have of, those amazing individuals. The reason they're stories of these amazing individuals because it's not necessarily the norm of the time that this is what people did, but they are still stories that we need to hold up as kind of like, this is incredible that these people did this and put themselves on the line. So yeah, it's the both and I think that's how it is throughout history for everything with the church. It's both and. So yeah.
See, that was warm, you know. Oh, look, there's a good glow on that. There's a good glow. There's a good glow.
I'm just pulling it out, you know. I'm like, I know there's something there in the back of my head somewhere. Like, we'll make this work. Yeah.
That's good.
As long as I say it with authority, you know, people will think I know I'm talking about something, right?
I'm reminded, so in our 20, I might get the numbers wrong here. In our 21st and 22nd cast, we interviewed with Simeon Hawkins. And Simeon actually mentioned a particular text to me recently, because he's a colleague of mine at Kingsway. He mentioned a particular text, which the name escapes me now, but basically advances this idea: if Jesus, the person, wasn't a thing, like if Jesus actually in Christianity by extension hadn't been developed, what would be the effect on history? What would be the effect on world history?
That'd be huge. It'd be huge.
And so one such idea that has been advanced is that the actual innovation of the hospital wouldn't have actually been a thing. So I did a bit of go on.
See, I don't know, because I've heard stuff about hospitals and things definitely coming out of ancient Near Eastern Muslim communities, a lot of Turkish, like ancient Turk kind of area. There was a lot of stuff around health and things. So it may have looked very different, and it may have been accessible to different people, but I don't know if I would say that the hospital itself, in terms of looking after sick people, wouldn't have happened, but the motivations might have been very different, and it might have not been open to all. But yeah, I don't know. That's just a bit of pushback on that one, but I mean,
love the pushback.
That's what I'm here for.
The research I've done on this is by no means exhaustive. In fact, the profession of doctor actually predates the innovation of the hospital. It's also interesting to note that hospitals themselves, as an idea, they had a Greco-Roman origin. Like particularly military infirmaries, like you know, Romans were known for waging war all over the place, and they established military infirmaries as a way of actually caring for their wounded, but it in no way kind of resembled what we would typically expect of a hospital.
No, I don't think it resembled kind of open for all, open to the poor, open to the plague victims, things like that. I think that is definitely something that came out of kind of monastic view of humanity and looking after the worst of the worst kind of thing. I think so I think it's the both and. Again, it's the kind of the Christian view and the world view of Greco-Roman worldview and things all coming together and forming a wonderful little society.
Well, before mentioning, say, the what brought about kind of the first kind of rudimentary what we would recognize as a hospital by that kind of descriptor you gave, it's important to note that in 165 to 180 AD, and then later on in 249 to 262 AD, there was respectively the Antonine and Cyprian plagues. And this was actually in Roman history an instance where Christians stood up. They definitely, you know, took a stand here. As much as a quarter of a third of the population of the Roman population died at that time.
Wow.
And Christians, interestingly, they saw the way in which they looked after the sick. They were seen to be looking after the dying and the dead with a respect for the Imago Dei in people. Because the culture of the time is very much, you know, to flee the sick and afflicted. Oh, you might get sick yourself, right?
Absolutely, yeah.
And so the Christian motivation for hygiene and sanitation, it doesn't arise in like self-preservation, but in this ethic of service to our neighbor. They actually saw it, early Christians creating like some of these first places of refuge to care for the sick during times of plague. They actually understood it as that negligence would be tantamount to murder, and so they weren't actually willing to actually look it up. It's interesting as well, like there's a sociologist, Rodney Stark. He claimed that the mortality rates in cities with Christian communities may have been as much as half of that as with comparable cities during the plagues. purely because there was this innovation of care. Like, actually, we're not just going to leave these people to kind of wither away and die.
Yeah, that some of these people might survive if we actually look
Exactly.
after them. Yeah,
Exactly.
yeah.
There was even a particular Roman emperor who got incensed, and he started actually kind of like sending letters out to, you know, the various temples and the various priests in those temples to actually say,
Mm.
we need to lift up our game in terms of civil care for people who are sick, because the Christians like they're doing a better
They're
job
making
than
us
us.
look bad.
They're
Yeah.
making us look bad.
Yeah.
It's so funny because people were converting to Christianity because in those times people were being cared for by Christians
Yeah.
and brought back to life, brought back to health.
Yeah, and their kids would have been looked after as well. That was another really big thing about monastic care in particular, was that, I mean, often with other kind of societies where it was just leave the sick to kind of either survive or not, depending on what happens with them. It's up to the gods or curses or whatever. The kids were kind of just left to fend for themselves while their parents were sick and dying and things like that as well. And so there was a huge mortality rate often among young children because their parents were sick and nobody was looking after them. And so that idea of looking after the widows and the orphans and things, that's very biblical. Monastic orders kind of took that on, and so a lot of children, I think, ended up surviving, and were actually ended up kind of not forced, but, you know, were turned into monks themselves because they had nowhere else to go. And that's kind of where monasteries kind of boomed, is in those times where there were a lot of orphans and a lot of people needing, like, dropping their kids off because they couldn't afford to look after them, and monasteries would take them in and raise them up and make them monks, and boom, power right there. And that's where it starts to get a little bit twisted. So, but I mean, it started off really nicely. Like, it was a good heart at the beginning, and then, you know, yeah, but anyway.
Yeah, like, I mean, like, kind of like our modern day, you know, childcare, but we typically do take them back at the end of the day, right?
Well, we do, and we don't kind of expect them all to become teachers because they
No,
were raised by teachers, you know. I
sure.
mean, who would do that?
Who would
Teachers,
do
ugh,
that? The
awful.
worst.
I
There
mean,
must be a correlation between, like, you know, teachers, kids often becoming teachers, though, I'm sure. My poor daughters. My
sure.
poor daughters.
Yeah.
Well, I mean, like, it's funny because, like, our in-laws are both teachers, and so Steph
Mm,
is a teacher. Her
yeah.
brother-in-law was a teacher for a time. I'm a teacher. Anyway, you know.
I mean,
It's
my
easy.
mum is a teacher. My brother is a teacher. My sister was a teacher.
Mm.
I'm a pastor, which is basically a teacher. Like,
Mm.
it does run in families often.
Well, I guess plague's the same. Like, if you get sick, your mum will get sick, and your dad will get sick, your brother and sisters. No,
Actually, all a curse. It's all a curse.
um, so, like, this idea of this Christian innovation, the first hospital that we've kind of been known as in the rudimentary manner, was attributed to a guy found out was named Saint Basil of Caesarea, also associated with monasticism. And this was around 370 AD. It's kind of a little bit earlier, within what was called historically the Second Medical Revolution. No, and you know, there has some attribution to actually the political innovations of Constantine. He was a very important emperor. You know, like love
Yeah.
him or hate him, like, he actually had
Yeah.
a
Good and
significant
bad.
impact. Yeah, definitely had a
Yeah.
significant impact on history.
Yeah.
Not just church history, full stop.
Yeah. Yeah.
Um, but it's interesting as well. Like, I make this as a note here. Quote this from this particular blog. Put this in, as we always do, link in the description. I quote this because this might be picked up on a little bit later. This theological and ecclesiastical influence manifestly shaped the ethics of medicine, but it even indirectly affected its science, since as its missionaries evangelized people of Western and Northern Europe, the church found itself in a constant battle against the use of magic and superstition in the work of healing. It championed rational medicine, along with prayer, to counter superstition. So it's interesting that actually at that point in time, there was an association of by Christians that actually science confirms what we're doing with faith. God's made a good world, a world that can be harnessed, stewarded, and actually we can make use of these innovations, make use of knowledge to actually be curative, to actually help people in these kind of circumstances.
It's interesting though, because if we jump forward a few hundred, I don't know, 1,000 years or whatever, to the kind of Middle Ages, where monasticism has a lot of power.
Mm-hmm.
And that's there's a lot of the kind of, buy this medallion of the saint and you will be protected against death, and that superstition stuff starts creeping back in. And I think it's a battle that the church has constantly gone backwards and forwards on. I would say that now it almost, and I'll talk to this a bit later, but like the hyper spirituality of today kind of ties in a little bit to the swing back to almost um,
Mm,
a little bit of superstition, a little bit of kind of like, well, if we just say the right words and do the right things, then God won't let us get sick, or
mm,
everybody who's sick will be healed. And I think you see that constant kind of pendulum in the Christian walk with health. And I think
yes.
it's that walking the now and not yet, of living in a fallen world where we have hope for everybody being resurrected and healed,
Mm,
and the life after this, but we live in a world where people are still sick and still dying, and we have
mm,
to accept that as well. And that's a really hard line for people to walk, because they don't like accepting both, because it's hard to
no.
accept both that are in such contradiction with each other. Um, so
Mm,
yeah, I'll talk a little bit about that later, but I do find that a very interesting pendulum throughout Christian history.
no, I think that's important to actually note. Like, there's I wanted to jump down that rabbit hole with you, but we'll come
Yeah,
back to that. We'll come back
I
to
know,
that.
I know. We could end up talking about all this stuff for hours. I mean, church history in itself is fascinating. Then you throw in all
Yeah.
the health stuff, and it just gets, there are so many rabbit holes, so
Mm,
many.
what a
It's
rabbit
so
hole.
interesting.
Hey,
Yeah, love
it
it.
should. I just want to mention here briefly as well, like when we're talking about, say, kind of pandemics in history, it would be kind of, I don't want to spend a lot of time on this, but it'd be unfitting if we didn't mention actually uh, the significance of the Black Plague within
Oh yeah,
history.
Black Death. Yeah,
Um, Basically, this was just, the world had never seen sickness of this
mm,
scale, right?
yeah. It wiped out whole villages. They're
Yes,
known as plague villages. They
yes.
still dig them up and stuff, where there are villages that are just wiped out in a generation.
Hmm. I mean, like
Yeah.
looking about the mortality rates for treated individuals, this is treated individuals, and this is today. You know, we can't imagine how much worse, like how much of basically a death sentence it was to have plague at that point in time.
Mm,
Mortality rates for treated individuals today range from 1% to 15% for bubonic plague and to 40% for septicemic plague. And in untreated victims, so this is within 24 hours, the rates rise to about 50% for bubonic
yeah.
plague and 100% for septicemic plagues.
Yeah.
So let me just let that last point, let that register. If you're not going to get help for uh, the septicemic strain of the Black Plague within
You're gonna
24
die.
hours, you will die.
Yeah.
It's as certain as
I mean,
that.
it wiped out a third of all of Europe, didn't
That's
it?
right.
Like
That's
it,
right.
it was, it was massive. Like,
Mm,
and the economic fallout to entire ways of life, and
hmm
like whole farming villages just gone overnight, and
hmm
and you think of, and out of that came a lot of famine and a lot of just complete social upheaval, and a
hmm
loss of like teaching and things that was passed down. And so I mean, that's why it kind of they call it the dark ages, because there
Yes.
was just this massive hole because
Mm,
of all these deaths, and you think
mm,
of all the wisdom and knowledge and things that disappeared
mm,
as well.
mm,
And it's horrific. It is horrific what people went through, and they had no idea where it was coming from either.
mm.
And so that's why you see that superstition thing, like if you
Yes.
buy this medallion, then God will protect you, because they had no idea how to
Mm,
protect themselves from this.
mm.
And so superstition is a very easy thing to fall into when it seems like it's a curse from God. So
Mm,
what else can you do? You know?
mm, mm. It's so like I mean, like you mentioned the 1/3 of Europe.
Mm.
The number I have here is 25 million in 5 years. Like staggering numbers, like five
I
million a
just can't
year.
even imagine that. Like if
Yeah.
that happened, if that was happening with COVID,
Mm,
at that level
mm,
of death rate, it
mm,
would be I just it would be catastrophic for the world.
mm,
It would just
mm,
be absolutely catastrophic.
mm.
Yeah. And
And
we need to
that's
remember, when we talk about pandemics today and COVID, we are not talking about
no.
what it was like for people before there was medicine and healthcare and all that kind of thing. And we need to
Yes.
be really grateful that even though we are facing pretty crappy times,
Mm,
we are in a place where we can access healthcare and we
mm,
can access stuff that and knowledge and information even about how stuff is transmitted and things like that.
mm,
We are in a much better place in history to deal with this stuff.
Yes. Which is like why one thing I'll say here, we definitely want to end with some, and sprinkle throughout like some pieces of advice, Christian worldview, weighing in on the stuff. The advancement of medical health, theologically, I hold that as like that is a provision of God that we actually have.
Yeah.
Like it hasn't escaped, instances of corruption or instances of abuse, because sin affects all of society, sure.
Yeah.
But that said, like the fact that we have a good, we have something that actually has stayed people from actually dying, is a provision of God. God has both access to physical means and supernatural means, natural means and supernatural means to accomplish his purposes. And so we ought to actually be thankful for the provision in God there.
Oh, totally. I mean, if you think about it, if we were born, 1,000 years ago, I mean, I'm 37. I probably wouldn't have made it to 37. Like the chances I would have had 15 kids, probably 2 survived, and I'd be dead. Like that's the reality of how far our medical system actually helps people. It would have happened. It would have like that's the reality. And people knowing that their kids were more than likely not going to reach adulthood, and like we are so lucky to be able to raise our kids and expect them to live. And I mean, there are parts of the world where that's still not a reality for a lot of families, and we need to keep that in perspective when we are talking about stuff like this, because it can seem really overwhelming and very exhausting when we're talking about COVID and about, like the stuff that just seems like it's really heavy. But for us, particularly in the West, we can raise our children and look at our families and have a reasonable expectation that they will survive. And that is something to keep in mind when we talk about all of this stuff, because that's really something to be grateful for.
Praise God to that, honestly. Amen. So the other thing I was only just going to mention there is that collectively it is said that the Black Plague killed as many as 200 million. That's getting close to like probably anyway, like huge proportions of people. Massive. We can't.
I mean, we have 5 million in our country. Like I can't even think of that many people.
well, even the 25 million before, like 25 million in 5 years. We have about 5 million. That's population New Zealand every year. In the 5 years it took to wipe out a third of Europe,
which is crazy.
So let's shift a little bit, actually talking about, say, the innovation of the first vaccine, which was actually known historically as the smallpox vaccine. So in 1796, there was a British physician named Edward Jenner, and he noted that actually, so just to qualify this first, there were as many as like 400,000 people dying annually at that time because of smallpox. Nowhere near the proportions of, say, Black Plague, but it was obviously having a dramatic impact.
Huge amount.
And particularly on children, like young people. Young people were having severe reactions to smallpox. So Edward Jenner noted that actually there were dairy maids who were working with cows, and they were getting something called cowpox, which is kind of like a less worse strain of smallpox. Basically, they were getting these pussy sores, from working with cows. But for some reason, they didn't seem to be susceptible to smallpox. I don't know how he observed this. I don't know how he confirmed this, but that's so the history goes. And so this part's a little gross, but he essentially what he did is he injected and retracted like a pus from these pox from the women, and took a small boy and injected the pus into the boy. It's gross, I know. But found that actually it was curative of smallpox. Like it actually staved off.
It's basically a very, very, very primitive form of vaccine. You're introducing it to the body, right? So it's like an early chickenpox party.
Exactly.
Inject the pus. Oh, that's so gross. What poor kid got put up for that one?
He's a hero. He
is. Is he named?
He should be.
Jenna got a whole lot of praise. Where's this kid's name?
Where's the dairy maid's name? Hey, straight up. Come on. But what's interesting is some of kind of the social reactions to some of this stuff, right? Because like Louis Pasteur, pasteurization, there was no germ theory at this point in time in history and in medical history. Edward Jenner could only kind of actually argue this from, say, a like pragmatic perspective. It's like it worked.
This worked.
But it
Yeah.
couldn't be shown and understood
Yeah.
why it worked, right?
Yeah.
But this started being touted like, actually, like, this works and this is effective and will actually cure people. And so we had, actually, in reaction to the first vaccine, we had the first anti-vax movement. People actually suspected they'd have side effects such as like blindness and deafness and ulcers, a gruesome skin condition called cowpox mange, and some people even suggested, and they had pamphlets for this, that you'd sprout hooves and horns by getting the cowpox vaccine, right? The smallpox vaccine.
Yeah. I mean, if you don't know why that works, I mean, it makes sense that you'd go, like, this is weird. You're injecting us with cow pus. So gross. Yeah.
So you actually had, like, during this time, it was one of the largest mass movements of the 18th century.
Wow.
Because people had religious and they had political and medical reasons that they would not actually take a vaccine. Verging on a kind of hysteria, really. But you see already there's kind of some like resemblance to what we actually see today. You had tens of thousands of people who take to the streets, and they brandished signs such as this was one I liked: better a felon's cell than a poisoned babe.
Wow.
So following the mandate, the protests were no longer limited to the vaccine itself. Just reading a quote I have here. The vaccine became a magnet for broader distrust in government. Like today, people in the middle part of the 19th century, when vaccination is made compulsory, are experiencing an enormous upheaval in terms of the political environment, the scientific and medical environment, technological change, new information, new connectedness. Everything's changing so fast, said Kirsten Hussey. She was a historian of medicine and author of Imperial Bodies in London. Vaccination really just becomes a lightning rod for a lot of these concerns around the individual and the state.
I understand those concerns. I mean, if you had no idea how it worked, it would seem like a very scary thing to give to your children. Like, it would be terrifying. And if there's a whole lot of mixed messages out there about what it will do, like, you're going to be pretty freaked out. I understand that completely.
But what also ought to be noted in the case of smallpox is that it was more or less eradicated by this vaccine. Took a long time, but it did actually have the desired effect. Jump forward a little bit. It's worth talking about Jonas Salk and the polio vaccine, right? Have you heard about this guy?
I haven't heard about the guy, but I know about the polio vaccine, because polio was a scourge. It was horrible. And so, I mean, we still take polio vaccines. That's
right. So particularly children were affected by this on a horrible scale. They'd be paralyzed in many cases, many cases they would die from it.
And this isn't that long ago.
No, that's right.
I mean, there are people like in our grandparents' age who have had polio.
It's scars, right? like some people actually
scars, and some of them like had to relearn how to walk, or they'll have those big iron compression chambers that they would put them in. And I mean, this is all kind of public record that you can go and look at photos, because it's only in the 1950s, 60s or something it started being eradicated.
What's particularly interesting about the Salk vaccine is that he chose not to patent the vaccine or seek any profit from it, because he actually thought, like, I can maximize distribution. It will get out there. More people will use it if I don't try to seek any kind of compensation for it. And his idea,
I approve of that.
I love that. Right? And his idea worked.
That's amazing.
There was one particular institution that tried to actually get a patent on it, but the particular approach, it was too novel to be able to actually say, oh, this is distinct, like, anyone could do this. And so, like, essentially what he wanted to happen worked. Quoting from the golden source Wikipedia, an immediate rush to vaccinate began in both the United States and around the world. Many countries began polio immunization campaigns using Salk's vaccine, including Canada, Sweden, Denmark, Norway, West Germany, the Netherlands, Switzerland, and Belgium. By 1959, the Salk vaccine had reached about 90 countries. In less than 25 years, after the release of Salk's vaccine, domestic transmission of polio had been eliminated in the United States.
Wow. Yeah.
Which is like crazy to think that it was basically in 1955 is when he actually first made it available. Crazy to think that it was that successful.
I mean, we give polio drops to our kids now because it's and you don't see polio in the community at all. But if we stop giving it to the kids, it may come back.
Yes, that's true.
You know.
So at this point, it's worth noting, like, we see obviously the smallpox vaccination work. There were other vaccines that actually had, more or less success. The polio vaccine, these are certainly touted as two very successful vaccines. So, we're looking at the history, we're looking at the record and thinking, well, where does some of the skepticism originate from today? So there were two particular sources that a lot of anti-vax rhetoric and sentiment really stems from today. Others as well. But in 1982, there was a documentary on DPT, the DPT vaccine. It's called DPT Vaccine Roulette. Just see if I can dig this up for a second. And DPT stands for diphtheria, pertussis, and tetanus.
Right. Tetanus, yeah.
Yeah, tetanus. So in this particular documentary, just a second ago, forgive me. This documentary highlighted stories of patients and doctors claiming that children developed seizures and permanent brain damage after this vaccine.
Was that true?
Well, it says here in this particular article that they actually took research out of context to attack the safety of the vaccine, but it actually had a desired effect of leading to decreased vaccination rates and lawsuits against the vaccine manufacturers.
Right,
And it nearly destroyed the American vaccine manufacturing industry. But it resulted in 1986, they created a Childhood Vaccine Injury Act, which was basically a way where you could file claims to the federal government to actually say, this is where I was caused harm by a particular vaccine, and they could actually compile that and address and actually see is there consistency in these claims. But yeah, more or less like it was taking these instances of the rare side effects, the crazy exceptions, and saying this must be indicative of the vaccine as a whole. So that was one that actually had still affected kind of the rhetoric of anti-vax rhetoric, this particular documentary. Also in 1998, there was a British physician called Andrew Wakefield. He released an infamous study, now infamous.
It's been totally debunked, hasn't it?
Yes, well,
yeah.
I'll get to that, right?
Sorry, jumping ahead.
Okay. No, it's okay. That claimed that the MMR vaccine caused inflammatory bowel disease and autism, that when the vaccine reacted in the intestines, it released a neurotoxic chemical that would actually cause autism in the brain.
And that's led to massive anti-vax kind of things in our generation of parents. And that's why there's now outbreaks of measles and stuff that happen in schools.
That's right.
In Auckland, there was one because people are not getting the MMR, even though measles was pretty much wiped out.
That's right. I mean, it's a curious one, like looking at some of the history, because basically there were people who actually, they found Wakefield's true intentions was that he'd been funded by lawyers who were working with the parents of the children in the study to try and find a reason to sue the vaccine manufacturers. So on the face of that seemed real suspect. But it's curious that today, even still today, this particular man remains an anti-vaccine advocate. So you could actually say it's like, okay, that seems spurious, but he's stuck to his convictions on the back of the study that he actually found. Something for you to wait yourself. Anecdotally, I wanted to mention here as well, I actually have an aunt who had a bad case of I forget the particular vaccine, but when she was about 5 or 6 years old, by my aunt and uncles and my mum's recollection, they actually say she was a normal, happy-go-lucky 6-year-old, as you'd expect any, typical 6-year-old to be. She had this vaccine, and she spent pretty much the rest of her life in care.
Wow.
She's had, grand mal epidural seizures, sometimes in more regularity, sometimes less. Symptoms that are very much resembling autism. Like she's lived with that in all of her adult life, all of her, the rest of her childhood. And she just lives up in Kaitaia in a aged care facility now. But it's, for me, it's an instance of, like, I do understand some of the skepticism, right? Like a little bit of a thing you might not know about me. When I was being groomed by the pyramid scheme at USANA, those guys, they do the multivitamin. I had a guy, like, he met me when I was working at Kathmandu, and like I went to a couple of conferences. Like, I was interested for a while. I tried some of them.
Sucker.
I know. Well, it must be placebo, because I was trying them. It's just like, oh my gosh, I feel so healthy. Like, where can you get me more of this stuff? So, like, when I was kind of in those circles, I was first exposed to that idea of corruption in big pharma or medical institution. I also read, like, about a year before that, Ian Wishart's book Totalitaria, which is,
I've read that.
there's some pretty compelling stuff there. It ends with kind of a very kind of spurious, kind of wild conclusion. But you can definitely take parts of that where it's like, I look at some of this stuff and it's like, not all of it is true, but I reckon there's some of it that's true. And it's like, I don't know enough to be like, which parts of it are true and which are not. So I defer to kind of experts in this instance, right?
Yeah, absolutely.
So it's like,
I guess I'm sorry.
No, I guess I was just going to say, like, this idea of dissent in the medical profession being quashed, unless it's rigorous, peer-reviewed study is accomplished. That can also be subject to bias and kind of be stopped at any stage of the process, right? It's kind of stuck with me, and it's why, like, I have skepticism about these vaccines and the associated politicization of all. Although I don't doubt that by and large good work is done, right? It's like, it's everyone had to make the moral decision when the vaccine mandate came around in New Zealand, when the vaccinations drive campaign was ramping up, to actually say, will I choose to get vaccinated myself or not? I didn't have a problem with vaccination as a concept. I was kind of like, what's the safety data on these particular vaccines? Because that's what I'm not sure of. Even after having been doubly vaccinated, just put that out there. That's how I feel.
Yeah, so am I. I'm double vaxxed, and was quite happy to do that at the beginning. But I think we would be naive to think that medical professions cannot be corrupted.
No.
And that pharmacy professions cannot be corrupted and are not in it for money. There are definitely people who are pushing for health breakthroughs and things purely on the basis of helping people. But the corporations and medical companies and politics and everything, we like to think people have our best interest at heart, but that is not always the case. And it is really hard with this whole continued COVID thing, because the longer it's gone on, the more medical professionals are coming out and saying they have serious concerns. And I have a couple of links that I'm not sure if I shared with you, Jared, yet, but there was one where it's a roundtable discussion of a whole lot of medical professionals, doctors and things, who are really concerned. And then you have a statement by the World Health Organization coming out and saying vaccines, there's not enough data to support vaccines for under 19-year-olds, and yet our government at the moment is pushing for 5 to 19-year-olds to get vaccinated against what the WHO is saying. So, when you start seeing that happening a couple of years down the track, and you start seeing doctors, there was a heart surgeon who's put out a thing like saying that myocarditis, heart irregular heartbeats and heart damage that can kill is becoming really problematic in young men because of the vaccine. And he's like begging people under the age of 25 not to get the vaccine. When you start hearing this stuff and it's gaining more voices as we go on, particularly with the boosters, people saying that the more you get vaccinated, the more problems we're going to have in our bodies, and in turn, the people who have been vaccinated more and have more boosters are actually passing on the virus more easily than those who are unvaccinated. When you start hearing this from medical professionals, and more voices joining that, and it's not just anecdotal stuff, it's actual medical journals and things, that becomes very, very concerning. And you have to start going, maybe it got pushed through a little too fast.
Well,
maybe
that's where
we
you
need
want
to just hold off a little bit,
Yeah, that's where you want to trust the standardization of the profession, right? Because I can understand that peer pressure element where this is one dissenting voice. It's like, no, shut that person up. Like, they don't know what they're talking about. It's like,
but when more and more people...
Yeah, but which is problematic because it's like, like if you have a course of action, we're all going this way, and like it's the established course of action, and this is why all the reasons we should do it. And it's like, I don't think you shut up over there, you like, you know. But when they actually have more voices, it's like, actually, should we have been kind of giving some consideration of what this person is saying in the first place? I mean, you can't.
Because when it's the one,
you can't live life like that, right? Like you can't.
No. I mean, I'm all about doing your own research, but I also realize that a lot of people have COVID fatigue, and they are sick of talking about this stuff, and they are sick of hearing about it, and they don't have the emotional energy or the time to go do the research. And so it is easier just to take what your people in power are telling you to do as gospel, because that's easier, and it is easier. And people who have got their kids vaccinated because that's what the government is telling them to do, kudos to you, because you're trying to do the best with the information that you have. And I think that's really good of you, but I also see more and more doctors risking their careers to come out and say that this is not okay, and they've got serious concerns about boosters, particularly boosters, not so much the original vaccines, it's the boosters and the continuation of getting vaccinated. That I really encourage people, like, just go read the WHO statement about children getting the vaccine and just start there, because it's actually like really important that you understand this for yourself and make the decisions based on actual information coming from sources that because we've got to, it's not just us, it is our kids, and we've got to think about that.
Yes, I so agree with that. I mean, like, disclaimer, like the politicization of this is so rank, right? Like, I see, like, governments they're gaining unprecedented levels of control, and like, by definitely peddling a kind of fair porn in these kind of situations, like, like, I don't believe, this is the disclaimer, I don't believe like there's this new world order that there's some kind of satanic cabal.
It's not the mark of the beast or anything like that.
It's not the mark of the beast, like that this is happening, right? Simply because I feel, one, that's spurious, and two, the genuine instances of groups like the Illuminati or like, Luciferian Satanism and everything, like, sure, there might be the odd, like, executive producer in Hollywood or something, maybe subscribe to somebody's belief, but they're far and few between, right? Like, they're not enough people. There's not enough of these people to kind of affect meaningful change, especially with the plethora of competing voices, right?
Absolutely. I say it's more money motivated. I would say it's less superstition and way more money, and I know Luke and I were talking this morning about how New York churches are being offered $100 to $200 per person that they can convince to get vaccinated in their congregations.
So gross.
Up to $200,000 per church is available. And I'm thinking, well, now the money is now politically pushing churches to do things that may be against their conscience. And if you've got a church that's really struggling, it could be very easy for somebody to be seduced into that. And I'm not saying that those pastors are evil or anything like that. I'm saying that they're human and often between a rock and a hard place. And I'll talk a bit about that later. But it's there's a lot of money in vaccines. Like Bill Gates has been coming out and saying, oh, there's going to be amazing growth in the vaccine industry and yay for them kind of thing. Like, I mean, there is money to be had here.
There's money.
Money.
Caleb was telling me, I think it was Caleb, that the person, basically on this important board in the States for media. Media in the States. There's this great conglomerate who basically own all the major media companies in the
They're like
United
too
States.
big,
Yeah,
and they own all of them. Yeah.
and so there's a person on the board, on that particular board, and then there's a particular person who's on that same person is on the board of Pfizer, the Pfizer vaccine. It's like basically people are putting it out there. It's like, is that not a conflict of interest?
Yeah.
I feel like that's a conflict
totally
of
is.
interest, right?
Yeah. And then you've got, particularly in America, and American politics has a huge impact on politics worldwide, because we see what's going on in America, and then people will start doing protests in New Zealand for Black Lives Matter when it didn't actually impact New Zealand whatsoever, that particular movement, even though, American politics causes problems around the world, right? And there are lobbyists in American politics who have a lot of money. So they will be people from Pfizer who have so much money, who will be going to their senators of their region and saying, we will give you millions of dollars if you push what we're selling. And so they'll push it through government things and all this kind of, so there is masses of money to be made. And because if it goes through in America, then it tends to have a trickle down effect in a lot of other countries, particularly New Zealand. And we've just got to be really careful and follow the money. That's what I was like, follow the money.
What I don't understand around some of this is like so like when COVID was first on the scene, right, back in 2020, early 2019, there was predicted that it would be like a 7 to 8% fatality rate from the
and there were videos of people dropping in the streets in China and just dying like death kind of deaths, like I have none of that's happened.
No, I have some numbers here from my dear dad, podcast number 10 for those who are interested. But he particularly
latent pitch.
He put a particular article up and gave a summary on his Facebook page. He also has a website which he runs articles off of interest. He said here that actually when COVID first hit in 2020, there were estimates that it could kill as many as 490 million people worldwide and 350,000 in New Zealand. Almost all of our early responses were based on these numbers. We now know that these numbers were completely wrong. The global mortality death rate from COVID has been about 5.5 million, 3.5 million in 2021. And that means that COVID kills at a rate which is slightly higher than 1/100th of the rate based on our strategy.
And most of those are people with comorbidities.
Yes.
It's not killing people who are healthy, fit, young. Like, that's not who it's killing. There are the odd outliers on that one, but it is mainly people with comorbidities. And we've got to remember that as well. We've also got to remember that when it comes to COVID statistics, it has now been proven that if somebody is killed in the States by a gun, they will test the body for COVID. And if the COVID test comes up positive, it is actually put down as a COVID-related death, even if it's like a gunshot wound to the head. So we have to be aware that there is monetary gain for hospitals to say that there are COVID deaths happening, particularly in the States. And you can look this stuff up. This is not tin hat bunker conspiracy theory stuff. This is actually legit.
We'll get to that.
Yeah, we'll get to that. But so just be aware that even those statistics that we have could be inflated beyond what is actually the reality. And so at the worst, it's kind of like 5.5 million people.
Yeah, I mean, the response with lockdown last year in New Zealand, in most of the countries around the world, that was appropriate because we didn't know. Like 10%,
had no idea.
Yeah, 10% mortality rate is like end of days proportions. Like this is like biblical plague proportions, right?
Absolutely. If 500,000 people dropped dead in New Zealand, that would be economically disastrous for us. Like it would be just horrendous. It would be every family in New Zealand would have somebody who had died.
Think about the economy.
Well, no, but it would have been like, it would have been horrific if that many people had died in New Zealand. And we are a small country, so that kind of number is like massively like powerful when it comes to just running our country. And when we saw videos of people falling down and dying in the streets, that's what we thought was going to be happening. I don't know, those videos have disappeared and nobody talks about them anymore, but
no.
Yeah, it's all very, very interesting.
Very interesting.
That's when my little tinfoil hat comes out. No, I'm not a conspiracy nut. I got double vaccinated. I'm all about, being careful and following, like, particularly masks and things like that, and caring for the vulnerable and blah, 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 blah. But I'm also like, be aware that it's not always what it seems.
Yeah, be discerning, I think, is
Yeah.
the biblical
Do your
mandate there, right?
research.
Yeah.
Yeah.
It's like the morbidity rate is kind of expected to be closer to like 1.73% now. Which is what's the other
You mean the
stat?
mortality rate?
Yes, the mortality rate, sorry,
Yeah.
not comorbidity.
Right. Yeah.
Good to clarify that.
Yeah.
Like another point that actually Dad mentioned here, there's being about 5.5 million around the world. While that's still a lot of people, it actually makes COVID just the 5th most serious cause of death in 2021.
Yeah.
And
I know.
I was just going to say the 4 more serious causes of death that year killed 42 million people worldwide compared to that 5.5 million.
And we are not, I want it to be very clear, we are not minimizing the horror and the grief that families who have lost people to COVID have gone through. I mean, I know a family I'm very close to, their father has died recently because of COVID, and you know, it's horrific, and it's a lot of these people are dying alone because their families aren't allowed in to see them, and there's a lot of fear, and families are being ripped apart by this, and we are not minimizing that at all when we are talking about this. We are not saying that it's only 5.5 million people. That's still the population of our country. Like that's huge. That is a lot of people and a lot of families, and we are totally grieved that people are facing that. But we have to be also realistic about what's happening.
Yes.
And the truth of what's being said, and where it's not truth as well.
And I think like that's probably a point where you have some points that you want to raise here, Christine, and you want to actually make here, and I can take the back seat and just put my hands up. And, no, but it's relevant here. Like it's a good segue to actually addressing what's contextually going on.
I mean, contextually, it's. So in my sector, so I'm a pastor, so I work with people through my church, tibchurch.com, just saying, putting that out there.
The invisible body.
Yeah, the invisible body, for people who are not seen or cannot get to their church and so are not visible as part of the body. Anyway, the people I work with tend to have illnesses, and illnesses that, when it comes to COVID, is very scary because I know people who are living in places where there are a lot of anti-mask and anti-vax things going on, and they have illnesses that if they contract COVID, they will die. And it's just their reality. And so they aren't able to leave the house. And that is really scary for them. And so we have to be very aware that when we talk about this, there is a lot of genuine fear out there for the people who are most at risk and most vulnerable to contracting this disease. And I think that's really where the church comes into this, because we are called to be with the most vulnerable. So what I want, where my heart is, and where a lot of my research around this stuff is around church, and how are we responding to COVID, and what are we doing? So it's particularly in the New Zealand church, because that's where I have most of my contacts. So if you're watching this and you're outside of the New Zealand system, it probably is a little bit different, but just bear with me. So actually, starting with the church that is not in New Zealand, one of the big churches, John MacArthur's church, I think it's called Grace Church. He, right back at the beginning, when the state said that churches weren't allowed to meet to worship, they had to close their doors because of COVID, their church said no, they weren't going to do that because Christ, not Caesar, is the head of the church. And they have a whole, we'll put the link up, but they have a whole statement about this, where basically it basically says, you know, because Christ is the head of the church, not the state, therefore the state has no right to tell us how to worship, because God has not granted civic rulers authority over doctrine, practice, or policy of the church, right? Now we have to understand that this is a very American viewpoint. So it is in their constitution that they are allowed to separate church and state. So the state is not allowed to have a voice in the church. So it's in the First Amendment. Congress shall make no law respecting an establishment of religion, or prohibiting the free exercise thereof, or abridging the freedom of speech or of the press. And so it's all about, you're allowed to do what you want, basically, right? And so Grace Church went, we're not doing this because this is against our First Amendment rights. There was huge backlash about it, and they got really vilified in the press. And then it ended up earlier this year, they ended up getting paid $400,000 from the local government because of the fact that their First Amendment rights were actually in jeopardy by telling them that they weren't allowed to worship. Now, we have to remember in the New Zealand context, we do not have the Constitution.
No.
We actually don't have the right to say that the church isn't allowed to be dictated to by the state. Now, there is this kind of unspoken thing where it's like the church is its own thing and it does its own thing, but it does still fall under governmental rules. We don't have it in our Constitution, as far as I know. I could be wrong if somebody wants to fact check me, that like the Americans do, there is no rights around this.
Hey guys, Caleb here, just doing some editing and jumping in for said fact check. Sorry for the poor audio quality, I'm doing this with my laptop microphone. In Aotearoa, we are afforded this right by the New Zealand Bill of Rights Act 1990, Section 15, the Manifestation of Religion and Belief, which reads, "Every person has the right to manifest that person's religion or belief in worship, observance, practice, or teaching, either individually or in community with others, and either in public or in private." We are also afforded this right by the UN's Universal Declaration of Human Rights, Article 18. Everyone has the right to freedom of thought, conscience, and religion. This right includes freedom to change his religion or belief, and freedom either alone or in community with others and in public or in private to manifest his religion or belief in teaching, practice, worship, and observance.
And though I understand from a political point of view where Grace Church was coming from, I had a few concerns about the other things they were saying. So they had a Facing COVID-19 Without Fear statement as well, where basically they were saying that anyone who has COVID or whatever, how do I sum this up without giving them the wrong impression? Basically, Jesus is stronger than COVID, which I agree with. So therefore, people should be allowed to join and worship and do whatever they want because it's not as bad as we think. John MacArthur also came out and talked about fake pandemics and all this kind of thing. And so he kind of went to the extreme the other way, which I didn't agree with, because he kind of put it down to, if you don't have faith, then you'll follow what the government's saying. And I thought that was really wrong. Because
an oversimplification, isn't it?
Yeah. And so what they're saying about church and saying, it is our right to meet as a community, as a church. I agree with that. I totally believe that the church is there to provide community, communion, preaching, and pastoral care. Those are my 4 big ones. If a church is providing community, communion, preaching, and pastoral care, then it's doing its job. But it doesn't have to look like that in person. And this is the thing. We don't have to gather as a large congregation in 4 walls for that to be church. So I provide community, communion, preaching, and pastoral care online. Some people have split services, if you are unvaccinated or vaccinated, or if you're unvaccinated, come from home. If the church is providing those 4 things, then it is still honoring God, it is still following biblical principles, and it is protecting people. And so what is the problem with that? I don't understand this viewpoint of we have to meet in person and en masse for it to be church, because that's not actually how the original church started. It was small family groups at first that then became bigger and bigger and bigger and then turned into churches and cathedrals and blah, 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 and so why can we not?
You know what strikes me? I was talking to a pastor friend of mine recently. You can tell me what you think of this. The concept of human rights is actually quite a, ethically, it's quite a novel and new idea, isn't it?
Oh yeah.
It only works so much as 2 nations actually agree. We agree these are human rights, and we also agree these are human rights, and we'll uphold them. We have human rights debacles, diplomatically today, because there are different worldviews and cultural understandings
Yeah.
about what we think humans are entitled to, right?
Yeah.
You think about like I mentioned, the history for a reason at the start of the cast, right? Like these Antonine Cyprian plagues, like what did the Romans believe the Christians had the right to do? Die and be, massacred, and to be like, tortured in front of a live audience in the Colosseum.
Burnt alive, and
Exactly. It's just like, that's your human right. It's like, so human rights are, I believe, a gospel innovation and a providence by Judeo-Christian values.
Yeah.
But we also have responsibilities, which I think is what you're advocating here, right? To
Yes.
be a neighbor. Like, you think about these people during the Cyprian Antonine plagues, these Christians was like at personal risk. John 15, willing to say, greater love hath no other than this, that he lay down his life for a friend.
Exactly.
They're willing to put their lives on the line to save and help these people, to be a neighbor, right?
Yes. Now, and I would say, like, if somebody had a really, really awful disease, like say they had the Black Death or whatever, and they were calling for a pastor, I would go, because it is my duty and my honor and my calling to go. I would not invite them into a mass congregation to come along because, hey, you shouldn't be afraid because people who follow Jesus shouldn't be afraid of illness. That is such crap. Like, and I have heard that from people I love and respect, being like, anyone who's sick should be allowed to come to church at any point because, they should be there for prayer and healing, and we shouldn't be afraid. The fact is that God doesn't always supernaturally heal people, that medicine is there to help heal people, and actually bringing them into a congregation when they have a really transmissible disease is totally unbiblical, to my point of view. Leviticus has friggin' hundreds of laws about keeping their community safe from people who are ill and all this kind of thing. That's back in the day. And then, I mean, Jesus
before Jim Carrey,
Yeah, like Jesus came to fulfill, not abolish the law. He had, he's not saying anybody's allowed, and he went out to the sick people and healed the sick people where they were. He didn't say, and then he told them to go get marked off by their synagogue leaders as healthy so they could rejoin their community. He did not say, you know what, you're sick, you're fine, just go to the temple and live it up. That's not how this works.
No.
And I've heard people also say that protection is not a biblical mandate for churches. And again, I would say that is crap. I would say that protection of life is a massively Christian fundamental ethic. That if we are willingly putting people at risk in our congregations, knowingly doing so, then we are failing in our job as church leaders. And I think it is disgusting to suggest that we should ignore that because it's not biblical. Protection isn't biblical. I think safety and protection of vulnerable and of our communities when it comes to health, particularly when we have so many more people on this planet with so many more illnesses, we need to take it seriously, Now, say somebody, it's very different if it's a non-transmissible disease. So if you have AIDS or something like that, right? Like you can go to school, I believe, if you're HIV positive, but it has to be logged with the school to say that you're HIV positive. So if there is some kind of cut or something, people are aware, so that if there is any kind of blood contamination, people are aware. But there is not allowed to be discrimination against a child for being HIV positive.
No.
If you came to my church and you had AIDS or you had HIV positive, I'd be like, fine. It's not like you're just breathing the air is going to give other people AIDS. Now, when people believed that that was the case, it might have been understandable for people to be like, I will meet you in your home. Please don't come to our church. It also might have been different when internet wasn't a thing and community couldn't be, and church services and all that kind of thing couldn't be done online. It might have been a little bit more difficult to advocate for separation of people out of the church when they're sick, But then that's why you have hospital chaplains, and that's why you have pastors visiting the sick. It's not the sick visiting the church, it's the church going to the sick. So we have, but I'm kind of getting all over the place now. But so I get quite fired up about this because I know I've heard a lot of people talk about unbiblical churches recently, or pastors who are not being spirit-led, they're being people-driven because they are following the traffic light rules or whatever. And I get really fired up about this because as soon as we start pointing the finger and saying, you are not doing this prayerfully, you are not doing this biblically because you are choosing to run your services different to what you've done in the past, that is just getting stuck into like dogma and into not dogma, like kind of law-based. It's law-based. It's like, this is how we have done church, this is how we've always done church, so therefore this is how you should always do church, and if you don't do it that way, then you're unbiblical. And I'm like, how dare you point at leaders who are between a rock and a hard place, who are getting yelled at from both sides and saying you are not biblical and you're not doing this prayerfully because they're trying to protect their people. I think it's just...
I think if anything, like their approach is this kind of hybrid model that a lot of churches are doing that advocates that they are trying to make the best of a complex situation. Like they're trying to actually...
They're trying their best.
Yeah, I mean, like we've been going along to City Impact more recently in Auckland, and I love that, one of the things they're saying from the pulpit is just like, we just want church to be open. We want as much as possible for people to be able to attend church, to fellowship in churches, and so we will do what we can to actually make that possible, I think that's the important thing, that we can agree to disagree around some of this stuff, but actually...
I mean, it's also, you've got to remember, even if we're being cynical,
yes,
churches get more money from bums and seats because people feel more inclined to give money when they're actually in a church building than if they're watching a service online. So I really don't feel like churches are going to be trying to push people out of church. No. If we're going from a cynical point of view, like they wouldn't be doing it from that point of view either. But I think giving different services, I mean, I started up my church before COVID even happened because people weren't being able to access church.
Yes.
And so when people start going, I can't access church because COVID and because, I'm unvaccinated, I'm like, okay, but it was your choice not to get vaccinated, and that's fine. But we also have to live within the consequences of that choice. But you can still access church. You are still able to.
Well, I think it's like it's quite a chokehold view of ecclesiology, right? That it's actually saying the church is this particular cultural product that we've received today. It's like it is a liturgical ceremony where you follow a certain format and you be in
stand up, sit down, sing a song.
Right, exactly. But it's like and if we go back to the very early days, and I know like a lot of ecclesiologists advocate this. It's like, let's go back to the early church. What were they doing in Acts? So it's like, well, it was very much people orientated, and it was very much like it's the ecclesia, right? It's the gathering, it's the coming together of the faithful. And
I'm sure if they had the internet back in Acts, they would have been using it.
Yeah, I'm sure.
Like I'm absolutely 100% sure that the church would have been reaching as many people as they could, wherever they could, however they could. And I just think, like, we have become, where the voices that I hear that are saying, oh, but we don't want church to be individualistic, and so therefore you need to let COVID in, I think is actually a very individualistic voice, because it's saying, I want my right to be able to go and worship how I want, rather than going, under the circumstances and considering the church's discussions and prayers and decisions, we're doing church slightly differently now. I will fit within that because I am part of something bigger than myself, rather than I want it done my way, and if it's not, then I'll leave.
That's excellent, Christine.
And I think, we don't go to church just for us. We go for our community, and we need to respect that community, and we need to love that community. And sometimes that means that we need to be worshipping with that community in a different way, and that's okay. It's okay to do it that way.
Well, like one of the things I note, I mean, it's interesting being like in a microcosm like Kingsway, right? 1,500 students, attached, churches and communities. Obviously, it's a reflection of Christian culture, is what I'd say. Like under a microscope. But I'm disappointed and saddened at actually how this vax anti-vax thing has divided the Christian community.
So am I.
The world is watching. Like it definitely looks at our witness in instances such as that. It's like the more important thing is actually unity there, because I think it's interesting.
Absolutely.
It's getting like, I want to mention this towards the end, but there's this great great YouTube channel by a guy called Martin Illes. He's I think I'm saying that right. He's an Australian dude.
Okay.
But he talked in this particular address called An Eternal Perspective on the Pandemic. Starts very early on actually saying, whose weapons are strife and division? It's the enemy's, right?
It is, yeah.
So it's like
absolutely.
If we think about the enemy's purposes for this pandemic, that Christians, that people, that, the world would actually be at each other's throats and actually causing bickering and quarreling and actually dividing and polarizing. That's definitely playing into the enemy's hands.
Yeah.
So Christians, knowing their scriptures, should actually be saying, we don't want to play into the enemy's hands.
Yeah.
Therefore, what are we missing? Where's the unity that we need to be striving for in even such a context such as this?
I mean, what would the world think if it looked at the church at the moment and we all went, okay, we're not really liking the direction that things are going in, but we will come together in love and support our leaders, and we will support each other however that looks. And if I choose not to get vaccinated, then that might mean I can't attend bodily, but I will still be there every week online from my living room. I will still give where I can. I will still serve. If we were doing that instead of this kind of like, how dare you, I want to do it my way, I hate the state, I hate the church, I hate everybody who's not doing it my way, how much different would our witness be to the world? And
Amen.
I mean, but there's a lot of things that are, so we talked a bit about superstition and stuff in the church around health and things, and I see that this kind of, it's a mix of kind of superstition, hyper spirituality, kind of that idea that Jesus will heal everything, so anyone should be able to come to church. It's like making God our genie, like if we just say the right things and we say it in the right way and we anoint the person with the right kind of oil, then they'll be healed. And I mean, this has been going on for years. Like I've had this done for me so many times by people, very well-meaning people, who refuse to actually hear what I feel about it, who will say, oh, but if you just pray this, or if you don't, if you're not doing that, then God won't heal you, or if you're, you still have sin in your life, so God won't heal you, or all this kind of thing. And we're putting it back on the sick people to be healed by God, and if not, then it's their fault. And I'm seeing that in this kind of hyper spiritual, superstitious view of like, well, God will overcome COVID. And it's like, well, God overcame polio by creating a polio vaccine, or creating the person who had the brain to come up with a polio vaccine. Like God can overcome COVID, but it might not be by just bringing everybody into the church and praying over them. That's not ever how it's worked. Like Jesus was literally 1 in a million, like, and everyone he touched got healed, and that's fantastic. But that's not how it works. And then on top of that, on top of this kind of super spirituality thing, it's like this idea of being a martyr is a huge problem in our churches today. This idea of being at war. We are not at war. And we are not called to be martyrs. We are called to be saints. And if that leads to martyrdom, then it does. But we are not called to go out on our little crusades and be like, I'm going to stand and fight as a lone warrior. You are never called to be a lone warrior. I am talking to whoever is watching this who needs to hear it. God did not call you to be a lone warrior. He called you to be a part of a body. And that body fights for God. If you are going against that body, then you are fighting against this thing that God created to be his warrior. You are not the warrior at that point.
Yes.
Now I do know that the church gets it wrong. Like, I am not saying just follow your leaders because they're all perfect, because that is not true as well. But what I'm saying is in very extreme times where there is a lot of stuff going on, when you start fighting against the church, when there's already bigger issues happening, you really have to stop and look at your motivations.
Yes.
And you really have to stop and look at your biblical concepts and understandings of what is going on. Because God has called you to be part of a body that shows love, not a warrior to fight your own battles against that body. So, like, And that idea of being the martyr has really got caught up in kind of spiritual circles. Brian Tamaki is flippin' boss at being the martyr at the moment, right? So Brian Tamaki is head of Destiny Church. He calls himself Bishop Brian Tamaki. I don't see any authority for him being called a bishop, so I just call him Brian Tamaki. But, we'll call him bishop if I need to. I don't want to cause any issues. But he was charged under the Public Health Act for attending COVID protests, which were all anti-mask ones. And then he repeatedly breached his bail conditions because he continued to attend protests around New Zealand. Now, I had a few issues around him being restricted from attending protests, because I don't know if people, like particularly church leaders and stuff, should be restricted from attending protests, because I do think protesting should be something people are allowed to do in a democratic society if it's peaceful, and if everybody there is happy to be without masks and get COVID, well, then that's their choice, and so I have an issue with the fact that he was charged with that, because in a democratic free society we should be allowed to voice our opinions, and whatever that looks like, as long as it's peaceful.
Well, weren't the conditions of his bail that if he preached, basically, if he spoke, if he did a public gathering speaking after bail, then he'd be arrested? Am I correct in thinking that?
Yeah. So he wasn't allowed to attend this stuff and speak, and he did. And I personally don't have a problem with that. I think if somebody really believes, because I think the right to protest and to be jailed for that protest, I think, is a very strong Christian tradition. People have done it all through Christian history against things they think are really, really wrong. And I'm like, cool. He took it upon himself. He took the risk. He went to prison, or he got fined or something for that. Did he end up in prison?
He's in prison now. Yeah.
He's in prison now. Okay. So I don't like that in a democratic society somebody can be in prison for a peaceful protest. I don't like that. I also don't think that he's a martyr, which I believe he's called himself, for protesting something like COVID. Now, if he was protesting something like Christians being rounded up and put in prison because of their faith, then I would be like right alongside him protesting and getting put in prison myself. Like, I would have an issue with that. Protesting COVID in a maskless protest when there is still research happening and people are still trying to figure out what is happening in a pandemic situation, I think was foolish. I think it was incredibly foolish. I do not think it's a martyr situation. I think he made a judgment call. I think he was stupid, and I think he went to prison for it. I think that's his right. That's his choice. That's fine. It's a foolish choice.
I think a lot of people are conflating, like I mentioned earlier, like the earliest anti-vax movement, right? It's that kind of conflation of political distrust, right? There's too many new things happening, and so it's all kind of in the same basket, and COVID's just kind of like the tip of the iceberg. It's so there are certainly things that, as Christians, what this government is championing or promoting,
we have serious concerns. We've talked about a lot.
Yes, we have.
We have concerns.
On our cast, we've discussed those things.
Quite open about our concerns.
And so I suppose, because I've seen some of the live streams of people at those protests and some of the content and everything, they weren't just talking about COVID vaccination. They weren't just talking about COVID. There was a lot of rhetoric.
There's a lot of stuff.
That's associated with it. So do you think there's a sense of, I'm just devil's advocating here, do you think there's a sense in which he's actually saying it's like, I'm not under trial for that, I'm under trial for all of this, and it's like it's all spiritual warfare, and the
I think that's what he's saying. Absolutely.
Yeah.
I think he made a foolish decision and put his pulpit in the wrong place. But then I think that is happening with a lot of people who are choosing to be unvaccinated. The number of people I've heard who are unvaccinated who are saying we are at war is quite scary, because most of them are Christians that I've heard say that. And this idea that we are in a spiritual battle. Now, I believe that we're in a spiritual battle every day, because we live in a fallen world that we hasn't seen the full return of Christ yet. And
100%.
So, we live with that on a day-to-day basis. COVID is an illness. It's not a spiritual battle. It is a thing that has been genetically or whatever, scientifically proven to be a thing, and doing this whole kind of the words I hear all the time are like persecution, segregation. It's like the Holocaust. I've heard from people they'll be putting us in camps next. It's like they're rounding up the Jews for the unvaccinated people, and like whatever your take is on getting vaccinated or unvaccinated, that kind of language is not helpful. That kind of language causes division further and further. It pushes people who are unvaccinated and vaccinated further and further apart. It pushes churches further and further apart, because then people start going, well, if my church agrees with following the rules of the government, then therefore they are also the people who are segregating and persecuting me. And so therefore those Christians are persecuting me, and I believe in my stance. So therefore I am correct and I am the most Christian and they aren't Christians. And that's when it gets so dangerous.
Yes.
Because Christianity is not based on what we feel about our vaccination status. Christianity is based on whether we believe in our hearts and confess with our mouths that Jesus is Lord. And if we do that, then we should be working together. Like this is, and when you have somebody like Brian Tamaki, who is very popular in some circles and a very well-known Christian face, taking that martyr complex, and then you have all these other people going, yes, so persecuted. I would challenge those people to go over to places where Christians are actually being persecuted. I would challenge them to go to the Middle East, to some of those countries where Christians get beheaded, and who have to talk about their faith in whispers, and who are over there being missionaries fighting the good fight. Where COVID is still happening in those countries, but that is not their biggest fear. Go there and then tell me if your church is persecuting you because they're telling you that. Could you actually just watch it on internet instead of coming in?
Oh yeah, exactly.
Like you are still able to access your community. You are still able to access biblical teaching. You are still able to access pastoral care. You are not being persecuted. I'm sorry, and I get really fired up about this because I know some really amazing pastors who are being hammered and being told that they're persecuting their church members and things like this, who are trying their best to uphold the law, to follow biblical guidance, and to protect their people, and are being hammered by people who aren't even in their congregations, who aren't even part of their individual conversations, who are, getting other people fired up about, well, if they're not doing this, then they mustn't be biblical. And I just think it makes me furious. And I think actually that is the more unbiblical thing in this situation.
Yes.
Is the division that is being caused.
Like, what's some verses I came across earlier? Like, I'm reminded of, say, like actually where, James 3 verse 16, for where envying and strife is, there is confusion in every evil work. Or Proverbs 10 verse 12, right? Hatred stirs up strife, but love covers all sins.
Yeah.
And then like you've got instances like Genesis 13 verse 9, where Abraham and Lot were doing quite successfully and doing quite well for themselves. But what caused division? It was, it was this strife, it was this bickering, it was this quarreling, right?
Yeah.
Or Paul and Barnabas, like, wow, the church is being established, like the new church, and like, great things are happening. Oh, well, look, they had some silly dispute that meant they can't work together anymore, right?
Yeah.
Which is like what was lost because of that, right?
Yeah.
I like that actually it's left in there for posterity.
Yeah.
I'm reminded, right, of actually this point that actually Martin Ellis, who I mentioned before, said about talking about this kind of allegorization of faith, because it's like we can, even say, for example, it's like, oh, I'm like a martyr, I'm this, I'm that. But it's like, even in saying like I'm like a martyr, even in the bare-faced statement, you're not even saying you are a martyr. It's like you're actually allegorizing your experience. I feel like when we have this disconnect about what actually is persecution, real persecution, like you're saying, and actually what our experience is, then we're gonna get into these kind of feeling-led impulse kind of situations, right?
Absolutely.
Martin Ellis kind of put this perspective where he used to ask himself, if I was faced with a Roman persecution, how would I act? I think, a lot of Christians have considered this, right? If I was asked to, recant or die, or I'd be burned to life or fed to lions, because this actually happened in Christian history, right?
I like to think I would, but then I probably wouldn't.
Yes. I totally understand that. Like I I've no points in my life I thought like 100% I would, like I wouldn't.
Yeah,
And other points
I
I'm
would
like,
go to the flames laughing,
yeah,
like it'll be
yeah.
fine. Praising Jesus all the way. I mean, I think in those situations,
Mm,
God gives you the strength that you
mm,
need. And I think there are probably people who are martyrs
mm,
who didn't think that they would ever have the strength to be a
mm,
martyr.
mm.
Um,
I've read some baller stuff from like, Fox's Book of Martyrs. They're like, oh, stoke the fire more,
yeah, like crazy stuff that
yeah.
they've said. And I like to think that if I was ever faced with
Mm,
that, that God would give me the strength to
yes.
do that and
Yes.
to laugh in the face of death and
Mm,
go, well, I'm about to go be with Jesus, so do what you want,
mm, mm,
Um, the reality is that I am terrified of fire.
mm,
Like I hate fire. And the thought of being burnt to death just like is like my worst
mm,
terrifying nightmare. And
mm,
I don't know if I could have done it.
mm,
I don't know, or if watched my loved ones
mm,
go through that. I don't know. And
mm.
I don't think anyone should be quick to say that they do know,
Yes,
because I
yes.
don't think you do, and I
Well,
don't think that we can
mm,
even relate that
no.
to not being able to attend church in person.
Well, like, here's the problem, right, that I see, and this is what Martin Elias was trying to present, that, like, it's a reality disconnect because that's not our experience. Like, our question that he says we should be asking is, am I willing to put my flesh to death to serve Christ now,
Yeah.
today, right? Like, our question is not, oh, am I willing to face a Roman persecution? Would I falter? It's actually, ours is one of, are we going to compromise or syncretize faith?
Yeah.
Or are we going to deny or disassociate, with Christianity? Or are we going to be bigots, or are we going to misrepresent the faith? That's the 21st century question of, in our time and our place, what do we do with Christian faith? Like, ours is not the Roman persecution question. That's our question for our age, actually.
Yeah.
How do we respond to? Because those are the crises that we are facing. Those are the questions that we are facing.
And I would challenge people to say, okay, if you have chosen to be unvaccinated, then are you willing to set aside your own desire and your own personal needs to be in your community the way that you want to be, and set it aside and die to self and say, okay, I have chosen this, and so therefore I am choosing to do church a different way in order to protect the people around me and to show them love, because I know, and I think that is dying to self. It is not, that is a more of a martyr thing to do, is to give up your going physically to community than to fight against the church that you love for your right to be there, even though you have made a personal choice on your vaccination status. And I'm facing the question around boosters, and if boosters become mandatory for me, and will I get it done? And if I don't, then that will have to change the way that I do life.
Yes.
And that's me choosing that, because it is my choice, my health. But then I have to take that to, well, how do I then lay my life down for my community and my church and my God by acting in a way that is in the best interest of everybody because of my personal choice?
Yes.
And I think people have just got so lost in this, and it's just something that's making me really sad and really furious to watch happening. And I think we are doing more damage to the church in our desire to do things our way than we are in actually sitting back and going, okay, well, I've made this decision, now what does that look like?
Like, I thought it was like timely when you had the talk from Dr. Ashley Bloomfield, right? Everyone who was in New Zealand and is a listener, they've seen the Dr.
Daddy Bloomfield.
Daddy Bloomfield memes. They've seen the mugs. They've seen the shirts.
We love him.
He is our Director General of Health. I think that's the proper title, right?
Yeah, I think so. Yeah.
With what happened with the COVID-19, pandemic in New Zealand, he's like been the public face, the government face on actually how we're going to deal with this. So he's been
the very calming influence. He's fantastic. He's been great.
Exactly right.
Yeah.
And
in lockdowns, we logged in every day to hear Daddy Bloomfield tell us that we're going to be okay.
Did you see? IMDb did they did it talking about the 1 p.m. update like it was a sitcom, and then
Oh,
someone
really?
made like a Friends, like, you know, like
Oh,
cold
that's
open,
awesome.
like
No,
dun
I
dun
did.
dun 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 dun, dun, like
Oh
Jacinda
my goodness, that's
Ardern and Chris
amazing.
Hipkins. Yeah, I'll send it to
Yeah,
you after the
you need to send that to me.
podcast.
Yeah, I think you need to link it below as well because that sounds
Yes,
amazing. Yeah,
you got it, fans.
yeah,
But what's interesting is that in more recent months, he actually did a talk for, I think the organization is called the New Zealand Christian Institute of Science.
yeah. I think it's called that. Yeah,
Yeah, like I think that's the name, the NZCIS.
because he's an evangelical Anglican Christian, isn't he?
Exactly. So Dr.
Yeah.
Ashley Bloomfield, which may or may not have been known to people, was a evangelical Christian, Anglican evangelical Christian. And so I thought his conversation was quite timely because it was around about the time where we were having the vaccine mandates, come through New Zealand. And he was basically saying, listen, I'm willing to actually own the fact that, this is my Christian faith weighing into who I am as a person and why I have done the different things I have done at each step of the crisis. And I'll be honest, in the talk that he gave, there wasn't a lot of like well fleshed out, conversation on theology. Maybe if the questions had gone that way or the topics, the content had gone that way, he might have actually fleshed that out more. But it was much more of an advocacy on works, on orthopraxis. He started out by saying a central passage for me is James 3, and actually think about is faith evident in the work that you do. And there was a lot of talk about actually this idea of, for example, kindness as a meta value, or the second greatest commandment.
Love. Yeah.
Love, right?
Yeah,
The second greatest commandment requiring kindness to neighbors, right? That as a meta value, it's something that all religions have access to. And actually, this is how we as Christians and as a society ought to actually respond.
Yeah.
I think that
And
comes go on.
Oh, I was going to say that doesn't mean that, either you or I, for people who are listening to this, that we're advocating that you have to go get vaccinated for your neighbor's sake. Like the choice, to get vaccinated, I still believe should be a choice that is researched. And I don't like mandates. I don't like something that forces me to have a medical thing done to me that I don't get to choose. But if I choose not to, I have to then accept that I have made that decision, and therefore what does kindness to my neighbor look like now? Well, it means that if my neighbor's a 90-year-old woman with breathing problems, I'm not going to go around and say hey to her. I might start holding up a sign over the fence and saying hope you're doing well, but I'm like there's a difference in the way that we then show that kindness. And so by all means do what's best for you and your family by what you believe to be true, but then also be aware that will change the way that you then express kindness and love to people.
So exactly, like I thought, it was interesting, his presentation at this and the timeliness of it. It's almost like kind of like a counter voice, like actually kind of say, leaning more on actually what we are to be doing as Christians and different things. Like he spoke about the need for leading in humility, or this idea of actually the stay home, save lives, be kind message that was being publicized with the first lockdown in New Zealand, how that was just an essential message. And you don't need to complicate it. Actually, if we're going to do the loving thing, it really is the simple thing, right?
Yeah, absolutely.
And just like very authentic, I felt like even in the 1 PM updates, I've had that sense of him.
Oh, he just seems like a genuine dude. Like
right?
I just want to know you. Like you seem like an awesome dude.
Like he talked a lot about as well, like the feeling a sense of imposter syndrome, or doubting himself, and
He's
feeling
very real.
Yes, and just trying, like he said at one point, it's like if you tell the truth all the time, you don't need to remember what you said. Was a saying he likes to actually remind. He definitely deferred to this idea of faith in yourself and the experience in the health sector, as well as good people around him, and politicians willing to make these kind of bold calls, and that the fact that everyone was in the same boat with the first lockdown, he was actually kind of advocating, it's like, hey, let's just actually make the most of this. My worship to God in the particular role that I find myself, my sphere of influence, means I'm going to be faithful with that which I know, that which I've been given and blessed with. And I feel like that's a really good reminder, actually, in our own instances. It's like, well, how ought we to respond? as a pastor of an online church, as a teacher at a Christian school, as a person who has faced a loss of employment because of the vaccine mandates by personal choice. There is a sense in which actually how now should we live, and actually if we stand on the strength of our convictions, I think there's freedom within the body to do that, but not without forgetting love, right?
And I think this, if we stand in the strength of our convictions, we don't have to scream about it. You know, like if we are happy with the decision that we have made, we don't have to then force that decision down other people's throats in order to make that decision right. We can discuss it openly, you know, like I've been having an ongoing discussion with my sister who was quite pro-vaccines and everything, and always has been. And then I showed her that statement by the WHO, because she has young children, and now she's doing her own research and things, and it's all very amicable. We don't yell and scream at each other, you know, when we've had difference of opinions or anything like that. Like, I think one of the massive things that I find really sad is this inability to talk about COVID anymore, because, you know, people immediately are like, oh, I don't want to talk about that. It causes too many issues. It creates too many arguments. It gets too heated, you know, or you get the people who immediately get fired up and jump down people's throats. And it's like, you can be sure in your conviction. You don't have to scream about it at people to make them change their minds. You know, like, that's never converted anybody. You should know that by street preachers, you know, like, where it's love doesn't look aggressive. Love is gentle, and love is kind, and love is patient. And we need to do that no matter what side of the fence we're on. And there is so much hate and so much division, and so many comments online about, well, if they're unvaccinated, I hope they die of COVID and stuff like that. And I just think, come on, guys, like, it should still like, be a choice.
Yeah, let's not even talk like, you know, Christian on Christian. So that's inhumane.
That's just just wrong. You know, it's like, okay, so you've decided to get vaccinated. That's fantastic. This person hasn't. That's their choice. You know, and that's fantastic for them. Still, you're still human. You know, like, and we need to be able to discuss this openly and honestly and lovingly. We don't need to shout about it. And I think that's something that I think Bloomfield was really big on, was just like, you know, like, if you know what's right for you, then let it be right for you without having to be aggravated about it, you know, like, and I think that's something that Christians in particular could really learn from, because we do tend to get a bit fired up about things that we believe, which can be good, but also is the world is watching everybody at the moment. And I don't think it's very impressed with the church's perspective on COVID. You know, I think they think we're a bunch of crazies.
Well, I think it's at this point, like, I want to mention a couple of things that actually, you know, even keel, you know, two sides, like, you know, I want to acknowledge some of the politicization that I'm aware of in New Zealand. And, you know, Christine, like, you know, I know you have your own points, and I want you to jump in and, like, we'll go down rabbit holes.
Oh, together. You know I will. Yeah.
But I also want to close out as well on just a couple of things to consider theologically, and just some questions to leave you, the dear audience, with, because they're questions I'm thinking about myself as I start a new year and actually think, you know, what does Omicron look like in New Zealand, right?
Yeah, and what do we do with boosters with children, and what do we do with all of this? And
exactly,
yeah, it's a bit scary.
Exactly.
Like, I understand people being afraid.
Like, the interesting thing in the context like New Zealand is, like, it's where I think there's some credibility to the dissenting voice, that things are getting so politicized in New Zealand. Everything has like a political overtone, right?
Yeah.
And I feel like, you know, this Labour government certainly has evident in a number of their approaches a policy of centralisation and wanting to consolidate government control. You see it in the likes of, say, the Three Waters bill that's being put forward. which I don't actually have so much of a problem with. It's because it's like quality of water, good thing, like actually put it under.
I do, because Topol doesn't pay for water at the moment, and we totally will end up paying for water. Yeah.
Problematic.
Yeah, I mean, we've got one of the major water sources for the North Island, so what is that going to mean for us?
True.
So, yeah.
Problematic then. But I guess in terms of the hierarchy, it doesn't rank as high as some of the other things, right?
No, it doesn't. No.
Like the rapid antigen testing, which is the current thing. So Bob McCoskey of Family First put out this campaign, which was talking about a Don't Divide Us campaign, and actually saying, listen, we get the need for the vaccine mandate. I actually thought it was quite even-handed in terms of Christian advocacy. We get the need for the vaccine mandate. Here is another way to do it without actually people losing their jobs and their livelihoods. Let's make rapid antigen testing necessary, viable, widely available, because it has been tested overseas. This is like... and so they actually basically said, like, let's make this available. So the government has actually taken that on. Awesome. They're actually making rapid antigen testing available. But there's even been politicization around that. The fact that, these people who have actually gone out of work, they still can't do rapid antigen testing if they've chosen not to vaccinate, to actually return to work. That hasn't actually been ushered in by the government, right?
Yeah.
Or the fact that there was National's been quite good at actually lobbying this at the moment, where they're actually saying, like, government saying, oh, there's as many as like 5 million rapid antigen testing kits in the country. Let me get those exact numbers. There's 50 million ordered, there's 14 million due to arrive in the month, and they've got like, I think, 5 million antigen kits in the country. But there's been this kind of growing report of actually rapid antigen tests are coming from the private sector. So companies that already have them, because they're being, responsible to their employees, they're actually trying to say, okay, we'll work within the system, we'll give you a test to see if you actually can work. The government is basically, okay, we're going to take what you already have, and we're also, any orders coming in for more tests to your private company, we're just actually going to jump in the middle and say, like, that now belongs to us. So it's the question of, the government is saying we have this many rapid antigen tests. It's like, how many of those are actually owned currently by you? You. And so that's kind of like coming from a policy of, like, let's centralize, let's control, right? There was an instance I read about where there was a denial of contracting to private labs. Basically, there was a quite successful private lab called Raco Science, which was actually doing saliva testing for COVID. And they were working for the likes of Air New Zealand and like some big profile clients doing some of their testing. But the government said, no, we're not going to actually, contract with you. Instead, we're going to require all private labs we're going to suggest a bill to require all private labs to turn over resources and their facilities, and you have to agree to a price that we set for all those things. There is the COVID response bill, which we talked a little bit about in the hate speech proposals, and the terrorism bill, which also affords certain kind of powers. Interestingly, more recently, the Children's Commissioner, which they're proposing they get rid of, and you can just actually speak straight to the government. There's the media being paid.
Don't even get me started on that one. That makes me so mad. Yeah.
There's the media being paid according to what they say. Like, there's a policy, there's an infrastructure in place where actually, because obviously we're very cash-strapped media in the COVID kind of crisis, COVID kind of situation, there's been kind of, some very critical people have called it effectively a gag order. Like, the media can only say stuff that's kind of positive or puts the government in a certain light. They can't say kind of discrepancy pieces. And so it's this kind of overall picture where you see our current government is very happy to centralize and kind of consolidate rather than actually, like, let's hear the multiplicity of voices, let's discern what's best and like what's most effective. It's really about a sense of like it's either ideologically driven, that's what the worst I've heard said about it, or the best you can say about it is like they just believe they know better than anyone else, so they're not actually willing to take things under advisement. And so I say this, I qualify this and give this example because it's like, one, I know there are some Christian viewers watching or listening to this, and it's like, I get it. Like, some of your sentiment, some of that anti-political sentiment is actually very, like, it's
legit.
It's legit.
It's legit. We
Yeah.
feel it. Like,
Yeah.
we've got some serious issues going on as well. Like, we
Yeah.
understand.
Like, not to mention that it's like, if we're talking about dissenting voices around the vaccine, like it's problematic where actually there's a really scathing article, really mind-blowing, actually, just talking about now. Actually, you were talking a little bit about this earlier, Christine. There's more and more information coming about the actual vaccines themselves, your Pfizer and your, I forget the other two. Moderna, yep. And there's one other,
And
Indiza.
something, I don't know. It's not over here, so I don't know it.
Gosh, this host doesn't check his facts, does he? Point being, like, I see there's more and more information coming out about that they're not as effective, and there's actually some serious concerns about the effectiveness of them. Which is why people saying,
apparently now they're saying that vaccinated people can actually transmit COVID more easily than unvaccinated people,
which is wild.
Yeah, particularly the more boosters you get, the more highly susceptible you are to COVID and to passing it on. And that's extremely concerning, and it's like, okay, along with all the other side effects that are now being talked about, particularly like myocarditis and stuff like that. So it's worrying. It's worrying.
This article, it's called The Long Read, Jacinda Ardern, Science and COVID Mandates, Events, Facts and Policies.
This is an opinion piece, this one, but you can follow the links in it to roundtable discussions and things that doctors are having. So just be aware of that. Yeah.
This guy, Guy Hatchard, he's a Dr. Guy Hatchard. He's a statistician and former senior manager at Genetic ID, which was a global food safety testing and certification laboratory. But it's interesting. He talks about some of his credentials in the piece and everything, and how he actually was kind of invited in a consultancy advisory role to some of the government making decisions around, say, the public health response to COVID in New Zealand last year. So,
and it sounds like he's followed the same kind of trajectory as we have, almost. Started off being very positive about how the government was dealing with this unprecedented kind of pandemic situation, and then becoming more and more and more concerned as things have gone on. It's a very it is a long read, but it's very interesting.
Read, yes.
Yeah.
But I think it was interesting. Have you heard about this this alternative medicine ivermectin?
Yes, I have. Yeah. I've heard Joe Rogan talks quite a bit about it, which is really interesting. Yeah.
Well,
I know a lot of people hate Joe Rogan, but I love hearing an interesting voice. So yeah.
I love Joe Rogan, so hate it. Come at me.
Yeah.
Well, he was curious that he took it himself. And like within, say, 5 days was apparently back at the gym, like, feeling 100% again.
Yeah.
And so CNN basically was they did a hit piece basically saying, it's like, oh, he's taking something for parasites in horses, like he's taking a horse dewormer to treat COVID-19. And he basically he had a CNN host on his podcast and was saying, like, why did you lie? Because that's not what happened. Yeah, it was a blatant lie, actually, how it came about and what was said. I just love that he kind of spoke truth to power and kind of called it exactly as it was.
And there is research that now shows that there's a state in India where they
Andhra Pradesh is, I think, the name.
Is it? Have you got that? Oh, look at you! I'm just jumping in and stealing all your research. But there's a province in India where they couldn't get the vaccine to these people, and it was being hit really, really hard by COVID, and lots of people were dying. And so they rolled out ivermectin plus some other health stuff that was not vaccines I think they sent a kit to every family in the region, and they pretty much smashed COVID. The rates just dropped like crazy, and they're basically a living experiment that worked without vaccines. So it's interesting when you hear this stuff, because the popular media would say that ivermectin is so bad and it doesn't work and all this kind of thing, whereas for this very poor province in India, it worked amazingly.
And pre-warning, if you look up on Google ivermectin Indian province, it'll come up with a whole page, 2 pages of why it doesn't work, why this wasn't effective. so just be aware of a little bit of confirmation bias. If you do want to do your own research, just kind of be aware.
Use DuckDuckGo, don't use Google.
That's good. DuckDuckGo.
Yeah, that's good.
Yeah, because it's like you want to hear pieces that are like even-handed, both ends,
Yeah, you do.
like supportive and detracting, right? So you can
Yeah.
make up your own mind about the stuff. There was even an example, I forget, it was a northeastern European country that did very few preventative measures. They had
Was it Sweden?
I think it was either Switzerland or Finland, but they basically said like, we're going to do very little, and then initially their numbers of deaths and cases skyrocketed.
I think it was Sweden. I have a feeling it was Sweden or Finland, one of those two, like real north.
Yes, and they initially skyrocketed, and everyone was kind of like decrying them and saying like, see, it didn't work and everything.
It didn't work,
and then the numbers dropped off dramatically.
Yeah.
Because they basically were saying like, oh, okay, so it's just kind of run its course, and we've got herd immunity in the population without all the need of these kind of like extraneous measures, all these kind of additional measures on top of. So they're interesting kind of in the discussion as a case of like, okay, if we don't do lockdowns, for example, if we actually do kind of like non-invasive measures, does the virus itself just run its course? Yeah. Because no one can deny like the economic fallout. Like I
worry about what it's going to be for our kids. It's going to be nuts. This lockdown period has been just slammed us economically. But there's.
Go on.
I was just going to say, I also know people in the States. I won't say who or where, but they are in a. They're in a town that and they haven't got vaccinated. They've had COVID 3 times, and each time it's like better, and like it's just like a flu. Like they've just, and like that's most of that particular region has had quite a lot of people have COVID, and they just are going with it, and it's not been a huge issue. So
yeah, I've heard that some of the conversation around Omicron, right? That they say actually like because it's more transmissible, but it's not as like.
It's not as deadly. Like this is the thing that people are like. I've seen so many reports of like Omicron. Oh no, it's coming to New Zealand. It's like fear mongering to the days. When you actually look at the death rates over in the UK in particular, they are nowhere near as bad as with Delta. And most people have a bad cold, and that's it. And it's like there's so much fear mongering in the press because fear sells. And we need to be really aware of that. And I know people who avidly read the news every day to find out what's going on with COVID. And I'm telling you, it'll be slanting your views on what's actually going on in the world. And I would say get off your normal websites and go read stuff elsewhere that has different opinions and follow those rabbit holes, like actually look into where are they getting their information from, because it's a lot of it is just blatantly false. Like it's just wrong, and everyone's freaking out about Omicron, and I'm like, actually it's like the least devastating of all the waves. Let it come, like it's fine. Like
this, if anything, it's like it promises like return to some kind of normality, right? Like
and I kind of think they had said to us, if we get 80% first vaccinations, then we'll open the borders, and then it was 90%, and then it was 95%, and we hit all those markers with New Zealand. We hit them all. And then they were like, Omicron's coming, so now we need to get boosters, and we won't open the borders until we've got over 80% of people boosted. Well, we're at 60%, and they're not opening the borders. And it's like, what happens with the next variant? Are you going to keep doing this? Like, we're a country that relies very heavily on tourism and imports and exports and things like that. We're a little island country. This is screwing us up. Like, this is going to really have a devastating effect. And we need to open our borders to survive. And I understand the fear, but it's at some point they keep changing the goalposts. Like it's crazy.
It's like it's definitely like, again, there's that economic fallout of it results in a rising cost of living. Like obviously our housing market is just shambles. Ridiculous prices.
But building materials, it used to be way cheaper to build.
Yeah.
Like we're looking at just building a fence in our back garden, and it is like tripled in price since we got a quote a year ago. Like it is nuts for building materials. And we're a country that lives off, like we supply wood to the rest of the world.
Yeah, they will be domestic as well, right?
Yeah, and so it's all, but the export prices are pushing up all the internal prices. And so everything's becoming way more expensive. And it's the poor families that are really being hampered by this. And so then, people say, oh, the government isn't forcing you to get vaccinated or whatever. But actually, it's the people who cannot survive without their job that do not have a choice as to what they're putting in their bodies. That is coercion, because they have to get vaccinated to be able to feed their families. And so they don't even have a choice anymore in what they do. And that is not okay in my book. Like, everyone should be able to have the choice. And if you financially cannot make that choice, your choice is taken away.
Yeah, that's true. That's true. We have with COVID, because it was going to affect all countries in these kind of ways anyway, but we have increasing unemployment. We have, with the lockdowns last year, there are like tens of thousands of businesses in New Zealand that have just disappeared forever. People...
Not even to mention domestic violence stats and things that are just like going below the radar. And you just think of all those families that are in stressful situations, already probably not fantastic. And those kids, that school was their safety. And they were stuck at home with their abusers, and it's just... And the mental health impact that they've had.
Yep, exactly.
Yeah.
And it's
lots of people have struggled with mental health because of lockdown. Like, it's horrific.
It's just kind of a perfect storm of like just terrible circumstances. And it's like, I don't envy our leaders, which definitely advocates a Christian response of like, we should pray for our government to make good choices, to actually be, not tunnel vision, but actually like we're going to hear from the best advice, and we're going to actually seek what is the best decisions in different situations. But
I'm sure they are trying their best. Like, I don't believe that our leaders are being vindictive or nasty or doing this with a laughing. I believe that they are trying to do their best with the information that they are being given. I just wonder, what is that information that they are actually being given?
Yes.
That's the big question for me.
Oh, and we didn't even mention like the MIQ debacle, right? Managed isolation, quarantine, there's this, what has been called online, a $1,500 a month lottery,
where famous people can get in.
Oh, people were like so incensed when was it James Shaw of the Green Party? He went over to into Europe for like a climate change conference. Important. Politicians should be able to do that. But when he came, even that was like a little like, but it's like, okay, I personally don't think it's a problem. Came back and was shortened on the amount of time that he had managed isolation. But by the way, had one of those 1,500 spots, just so happened to have one of those 1,500 spots where
was there.
Come and go easily. That had shortened time. And then was told, oh, you don't need to be in the facility. You can just do isolation at home. You can actually just the people.
Which everybody is like, what the heck? How come he gets to isolate at home and no one else is allowed to?
Exactly. Yeah. Exactly. It was a total different standard for the people in power, basically. Some people were talking about, Jacinda had to cancel her wedding. It's so sad. She's just like one of us. But some people have said, well, it's kind of like virtue signaling, because you were getting, Lord to come into the country to come and perform at your wedding. Yeah. And she just happened to get an MIQ spot.
Yeah, just amazingly opened up. Yeah.
Amazingly, right? Or this one I'm less, I'm less of a problem with, but this idea of these property investors that were willing to sign a pledge that they would actually invest $10 million into New Zealand, that they actually got kind of like a priority in the MIQ, that they could actually come into New Zealand as well.
Yeah, but then there are overseas people who are buying up all our housing and then causing the housing market crisis that we're having as well. So it's kind of like, well, do we want them?
Yeah, exactly.
I do, yeah.
And then the problem of there's only, it's been publicized in the news a number of times. There's only 200 ICU beds, right? Intensive care unit beds in the country. It's like,
and the whole of Lakes District, which is where I am, right? Which is Rotorua, Taupo, Tokoroa, right down to it's like the whole Central Plateau lakes, right out to almost to the edge. We have 4 ICU beds.
Are you kidding me? 4.
Yeah. 4, and so if anything happens, basically people get sent up to Waikato or to Auckland. We have 4 ICU beds.
Will they have 10, or they?
Yeah, maybe. Yeah, they might be in a hallway instead of out on the street. But they have it. That hasn't changed since the beginning of the pandemic. There hasn't been any more money put into making more ICU spaces. There hasn't been any more nurses trained up. There haven't been, that is hugely problematic to me because they've had 2 years to pump money into that sector to make sure that if anything did happen, it would be okay. And so this whole but there wouldn't be enough ICU stuff, so we don't want the hospitals to get overloaded. You had a chance to fix that and you didn't. And so that's on you.
And then wasn't Grant Richardson, he's with this $150 million plus that they've actually had in the budget for COVID-19, it's gone to all these kind of subsidiary things that have nothing to do with COVID,
it's gone to very bizarre places.
It's wouldn't you want that to go to ICU beds? Kind of
I understand a lot of the money going into bailout businesses and stuff that have needed it.
Sure,
and I respect
I
respect that they were doing that, particularly our tourism industry. They have needed a hell of a lot of help over the last little while. But to not be pumping money into ICU and into mental health is just majorly dropping the ball. And that is really concerning because it hasn't actually changed the issue at all. So if another pandemic happened, we'd be in exactly the same situation when they had the chance to actually sort it out for in this pandemic and to give us another 100 beds or whatever, which is still ridiculously low for New Zealand. But they've dropped the ball. They've dropped the ball. They started off with a hiss and a roar, and they've gone and dropped the ball.
Exactly right. So it's we're giving that context, both of us here, to actually say we understand that sentiment that it's what's our government doing? This is really frustrating because it's that needs to be validated to actually say a Christian response needs to take into consideration when there is ineptitude or as there is, not the best courses of actions taken that could have been taken, right?
And you can say that stuff without being divisive. And I think for me the big thing is unity within the church. Speaking out against politics, that is our right in a democratic society to say you've dropped the ball and I am not okay with this,
Which as a Christian being in a democratic society, you are afforded that right to be able to exercise that.
Exactly. So they're having a mental health overhaul of the Mental Health Act at the moment, and I have put in a submission of my thoughts on it because I've been intimately involved with the mental health sector for many years for many different reasons, and and so I have a lot of insight into that, and I know that they're dropping the ball there, and so I will be strong-worded in that, but at the same time, I'm not then going to turn around and take all of that political frustration into my church and start attacking people who don't agree with me, who are saying that the Mental Health Act is fantastic and the mental health system is amazing. I can have a discussion with them, but I'm not going to cause division over it. And I think that we need to have that same kind of mentality when it comes to COVID, which is a lot more emotional for a lot more people. And we need to be aware that we can speak out truth to power without then turning around and dividing our communities.
It's I love the both andness of scripture because it's you have the book of Colossians, which is total political theology and propaganda. It's the way they're talking about Jesus in chapter 1 is the way they talk about Caesar. So this is this is a revolutionary statement. This is political dynamite. And then you have in Romans,
it's going to get them killed.
exactly. But then you have in Romans 13, pray for those in authority. Pray for those who actually make right decisions. So there's actually a sense of, we're in this world but not of it. That's always been the case, within our Christian belief. There's this advocacy of we want to pray for them because they're in a difficult position being in that situation. And you
can speak truth without hate.
Yes.
So there's a difference between attending a protest about something and then threatening to blow something up. There's those are two very different stances, even though they might have the same end goal. And it's how are we expressing our frustration? Are we doing it in love? Are we speaking to power in a way that is still honoring the people in power, that is still respectful of them and the information that they have that we don't have, but is also saying you need to hear us as well. And we are not in a country that has a dictator that we need to fight against in order for human rights to be seen. Jacinda is not demon possessed. She is not the devil. She is not Hitler. She is a young woman, my age, who is doing her best to lead the country through crazy, crazy times. And we do need to pray for her.
And probably fear-based in a lot of her decisions, I think. That's my
I think so. And she probably is getting so much more information from so many different sides. If you feel confused, how confused must she feel? Have compassion for her, even as you are saying, I don't agree with what you're doing here. Because there's nothing, you're going to be heard a lot more when you stand and say it in a place of love and say, I really want you to get this right for us, Jacinda, than if you go, I hate you, burn in hell. Like that's not going to get through to anybody. That's just going to get shut down.
Yep. Like, in terms of our advocacy, I'm going to give Christine a quick little pop quiz.
Okay.
Because it harkens back to where we actually started with this podcast. I'd love for you to tell me, who do you think said this?
Oh, Lord.
Who do you think said this? I shall ask God mercifully to protect us. Then I shall fumigate, help purify the air, administer medicine, and take it. I shall avoid places and persons where my presence is not needed in order not to become contaminated and thus inflict and pollute others and so cause their death as a result of my negligence. If God should wish to take me, he will surely find me, and I have done what he has expected of me, so that I am not responsible for either my own death or the death of others. If my neighbour needs me, however, I shall not avoid a place or person, but will go freely as stated above. See this as such a God-fearing faith, because it is neither brash nor foolhardy, and does not tempt God.
I like it. Someone incredibly wise who said that. Are we talking? Give me like early church, middle church,
middle church. It's not recent. That's the surprising thing.
I wouldn't have thought it was recent. I would have thought someone like St. Francis of Assisi or something like that would have said something like that. Yeah, I feel like it's a monk or someone like that, who was Christian but facing a plague.
This was our dear old Martin Luther.
There you go. Yeah. Not a monk.
And we talked about the plague, right? We talked about that was what he was facing. He was talking about the situation where actually in his own lifetime he refused, he faced the plague. He refused to flee Wittenberg. He stayed to minister to the sick. It even cost his own daughter his life. And he actually even later wrote a work whether Christians should flee the plague. So there was this consideration, actually, he understood actually this being a neighbor, to lay down your life for another, that is the greatest show of love, because Jesus has done that for us. That is a Christian response here, and I think an exemplary one at that.
Absolutely.
Even John Calvin faced the plague on 5 different occasions throughout his life, and very similar kind of response. He sought to care for the people of his city during the days of the bubonic plague. And
they very rarely agreed on anything, Luther and Calvin. So
it's interesting that actually in both their responses, just have some notes right here. His priority was to make sure that the word of God continued to go forth. The pastors in Geneva preached Christ to those they were around, and Calvin preached many funerals, which led to many people being saved. Though it may have seemed like numerous plagues would hinder the gospel in a similar fashion to the first imprisonment of Paul in Rome, the exact opposite was true. Calvin, through each wave of his life, as he was confronted by the plague, he continued to minister. Which I think puts an interesting point, right? I mentioned Martin Illes before in his message before. He quotes from Job and how Satan was allowed, Hasatan was allowed by God in that narrative to cause the Chaldeans and cause the Sabaeans and cause the whirlwind to actually gut Job of his life, his community, his livelihood, and that actually he was allowed to do that according to his purposes. Satan was allowed to do that according to his purposes. it kind of puts then a perspective that actually, if that was allowed by God in that instance, God must have had a more supreme purpose beyond. And I think that's a sobering thought when we think about this pandemic, when we actually think about all the bad, all the terrible that has actually happened associated with this. God does not will evil, but he can bring good about through it. And I think there's a question of actually, while we're in these two worlds, we're both in the world but not of it, we're actually in eternity right now. We are seated alongside Christ. We are in heavenly places. Like, it's the way he pictures it in the particular presentation is like heaven isn't up there and we're down here. It's more like heaven is around you. The kingdom of God is within you. Heaven is the presence of God and the relationship of God. That sobering sacred reality actually gives us a sense of like, what is God's purpose in this pandemic? And what is the church supposed to be doing? What are we frittering away our time thinking about and focusing on that isn't about the causes of King Jesus, right?
Yeah, absolutely.
He advances this idea, like, this is probably a conversation for another time, but about like, are we under a kind of judgment that this is happening, right? That this is society falling away as it is?
That's a very common, historically very common way to go when things like this happen, is to go, is God judging us? I personally err on the side of, I think illness just happens. And I think that it is the reaction of the church within that is the mark of what God's work is doing. I personally don't like the idea of God using illness to judge the world. I know that there are biblical precedents for that, but I don't know. It just doesn't sit well with me, so I kind of just ignore it.
He kind of qualifies
it. Just ignore it.
He qualifies it more in terms of not that the pandemic is the judgment, but that actually the kind of society we've inherited, the kind of social dynamics, the cultural things at play. Kind of like, an exegesis on the book of Judges, right, for example, where we actually see like not the pandemic, but the kind of things that we have at play and the kind of responses that we are having to the pandemic and how Christians are behaving during the pandemic.
I mean, I think God definitely uses these situations to strengthen and to build his church, and also to whittle away his church sometimes. It definitely sorts out wheat from chaff sometimes. But I think that, it's our response to God's work in that, and so, for example, like, I mean, I was thinking about that quote you just read, Luther's quote, and one of the things that I have done in my community, and this isn't to toot my own horn, this is just something that I decided to do, is even though I'm vaccinated, I have there's a Facebook page for unvaccinated people in Taupo, and I have joined that, and I've joined the Voices for Freedom group to say, I am a pastor who is willing to come into homes if you need somebody, and your church isn't available to do that, because I feel that we need bridges. We need to fill those gaps where people are starting to go, well, you're on that side and I'm on this side, and how do you, to actually be like, okay, so I'm vaccinated, but I'm still here with you in this, and I still respect your choice, and I still think you're human, and I hope you don't get COVID, but I'm here for you, and I think that is really, it's shows how far individualism has seeped into our theology when we are unable to do that, and we start pushing our own way of doing things as the right way, and I think that's really dangerous, and I think it shows hugely for the West, particularly at the moment, how far individualism has gone to where we look at it and go, well, it's about community, and it's like, is it, or is it about you at the moment?
Well, it's like, I think like your advocacy there is like, it's again thinking about actually what is our response, what is our individual response, right? Because I think,
but not even individual response. What is our response as
to our
a
communities?
church?
Yes, forgive me. I'm not wanting to take away from your saying.
No. But like, so if we're part of a church that has decided to go in a certain direction, and we have committed to that church, and we have said we believe in this ministry up until this point, like, is it our own individual desires that is pushing us away from that ministry? Or are we going to get on board and go, okay, I don't like this. It makes me a bit uncomfortable because I would prefer to do it a different way. But I am supporting this ministry because I believe in these leaders who have supported me, who have worked with me, who have given me pastoral care and support for however many years I've been involved in this. And so therefore I will support them back.
Yes.
And I will support this church back because they have given so much to my life. And that, I think, is about putting our own lives down for our body, our local body,
Kind of altruistic trust, hey?
Yeah, because, like as a pastor, I put a lot of myself into, the work that I do with other people. I pour myself out for other people. And I like to think that they trust me enough to come to me with their problems, so therefore they would trust me enough if I made a decision that they might not like, that they would trust that I had prayed about it and I had done Bible study, and because they had trusted me in other times. And so I like to think that they would support me if I made a call that they were like, well, I'm not sure what I think about that, but I'll support you until I've done enough research, until I think you're a flaming heretic or whatever, that they wouldn't just go, no, I don't like it. Like that they would trust me a little bit. And I think that shows a real lack of trust and a real lack of love towards our leaders and in our churches. And I think that's really sad.
Well, I feel like, because that elevation of actually God's in control of all of this, even in the seeming chaos, even in the disunity, God's actually in control of that.
Yeah.
That's a wildly confronting and just like sobering thought, right?
Yeah.
Like it's the idea that actually leaders will have to give an account of their actions. And it's better that they give it now rather than later. It's better that the politicians that we disagree with actually go, you know what, I was wrong, and I want to learn from that, and actually I bend the knee to King Jesus because he's actually the best hope for this world. And then informs their policy, and informs their way they actually live out governance.
Yeah.
Because all of us have that kind of space, right? And I think what belief do we have of God's sovereignty and our due diligence that we have done everything we can do while still seeking to be righteous, right?
Absolutely.
I think like it's that parable of the wicked servant, right? Like we need that last days thinking that actually says, we should be the busiest we've ever been if we really think Jesus is just about to return.
Yeah.
We're going out there evangelizing, we're going out there spreading love, we're going out there trying to do as much as possible to advance the kingdom. And if the pandemic, COVID-19 pandemic is a part of that, like then we actually need to be more busy, more about actually getting into the word and actually getting back to what actually Christ is requiring of us than not, right?
Yeah. And I think we need to not double down so hard on our own views.
Yes.
And actually, like, if we truly believe that Jesus is coming back soon to claim his bride, then we really need to be part of that bride. Like I did not used to be so big on community and the body and the bride and all this kind of thing until I actually started realizing how much it's in the New Testament in particular, and in the Old Testament, the elect of God and like all that kind of thing. I'm not a Calvinist, but like that whole kind of, there is a people of God. And I think if we truly believe Jesus is coming, do we want to be found fighting with that bride, or do we actually want to be part of that bride, supporting it and growing it and loving it? And
well, it's like, I think like in terms of our human engagements, we often think too much of the humanity side of Jesus, thinking like, but we also think like this God in control of history as it is right now. Like Revelation 1, again, Martin Miller's, he gives this idea of like, we have this colossus, he has 7 stars in his hands, and is like his appearance is like the sun, so that you can't even look at him properly, and his eyes are like bigger than anything you've ever imagined, incomprehensible. And John is so overcome, even as a believer in Christ, that he's like he fears that he's dead, right? Like in the same occasion, Miss Martin Miller's talked about Christopher Hitchens' brother, Peter Hitchens. Christopher Hitchens was the famous atheist thinker of the 20th century, of the Four Horsemen fame. Peter Hitchens was his brother, and actually not a lot of people know, a strong believer in Jesus.
Oh, wow.
And so one of the things in one documentary, he apparently describes his conversion story where he was working behind the Iron Curtain in Russia, leading up to the fall of the Berlin Wall. And he was in this particular cathedral, and he saw this church about the coming day of the Lord. And on this particular painting, this fresco painting, there was this person in the corner who was so overcome with fear at seeing Christ return, they were throwing up. Like they were like vomiting.
Yeah.
And so Peter Hitchens looked at that. It's like, if this is true and that's really happening, that's me. That's me right
absolutely.
now. And he gave his life to Christ right then. Because it's this idea of like, if we really believe that Christ is in control, and that vision of actually isn't just like an allegorized, super spiritual reality, so therefore not real. Like, no, like Jesus
is the judge of the world.
Is the judge of the world, and he's in control right now. And actually the mode of operation that he's wanting to do right now is in the midst of all this seeming chaos, and wanting the church to be church, wanting the bride to be faithful, wanting us to follow the same commandments that haven't changed. Be love, be salt and light, represent me well in the world. Like, they haven't changed up until he returns. Then I think it's like, we ought to be busying ourselves with that and be ready for when he does come, right?
Heck yeah.
The questions I want to ask myself and leave all of you guys with, this question again of are we causing division, or are we seeking unity? Are we causing strife, or are we fighting for causes that aren't actually our king's? Are we praying prayers of repentance for our society and our world? Are we seeking to live out the kingdom of heaven is within you? Are we compromising and forsaking Christian living in our sphere of influence? And definitely related to the political angle, are we praying for our leaders that they would come to know Christ, or that at the very least they would make right decisions? Their authority comes from above, if we're to take actually Jesus' own words at face value. And I think like that's what we've actually got to remember, actually, with COVID-19 pandemic. Ultimately, our King is in control. So be ready for when he returns.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely.
Well, dear friend, this has been great.
Yeah.
Been a lot of fun.
Yeah. As always.
As always. I'm really hoping that people can gain something of blessing with this. And even if we actually have the unity and diversity disagreements and arguments in the comment sections, that's good, because that's how I think actually Christ sanctifies his bride also.
Yeah. I mean, I am all for theological debates. Like, I'm all for people, like, iron sharpens iron, like, debates are good, but you can still be kind, and you don't have to be nasty, and you don't have to vilify the other side. So if you are debating in the comments, feel free, go hard, love it, want to read it, but be kind, and remember that the person on the other side is probably trying to faithfully follow Jesus just as much as you are. And that doesn't mean that you'll come up with the same result at the end necessarily, but that doesn't mean that they are not Christian, or that you can vilify them for having a difference of opinion. So just keep that in mind.
Who has their own vaccine mandate choice they've had to make, or someone who's died from COVID, or a loss of life or a loss of employment. Like, they've had all these same dynamics that we ourselves have actually had to form an opinion, form a response on the basis of.
Absolutely.
So I think that should season our actions with love and with grace, I think.
Yeah, absolutely. And you can disagree with us completely, and we're okay with that. We have thick skin, but still remember that we're human as well. We've had to come to our decisions through our own life stories and things like that. So I know it's easy and on the internet, when you're not having a face-to-face discussion, to say whatever you think without really thinking about it deeply. Just be kind, be loving, be gracious.
Amen. Dear friend, do you want to pray to close us out?
Absolutely, I can do that. Jesus, thank you for this podcast, for our listeners, for Jared, for the opportunity to be able to come together and to discuss quite difficult topics at times, to look into history, to be able to see your work and your hands throughout the church and its life, to be able to hear the voices of people who have gone before us and how that speaks to us today, even though our situation seems very different. There is truth wherever it is to be found. And we thank you for the opportunity that technology and this world brings, to be able to bring people together and to be able to speak to things when we are far apart from each other. Lord, I ask for your blessing over all of the listeners, that whatever you need them to hear from this podcast, they will hear, that we will open discussions and that it will bring about deeper thinking and perhaps change in hearts if that's what's necessary. And yeah, a way to start conversation as well, and particularly with a topic that can get quite heated for people at the moment. Lord, we pray for our leaders. We pray that you help them make wise decisions, that ultimately you bring them to yourself and that they worship you and praise you in all the works that they do. But if they don't come to you, we ask that you surround them with people who can speak truth and wisdom to them, that they are surrounded by people who will faithfully pray for them and uplift them before you at all times. Lord, we pray for this country and the division that it currently faces. We ask for healing. We ask for an end to the pandemic as well, but we ask for a community of love and of grace, and a heart to reach over to the other and to hear what the other has to say. And Lord, we pray for our churches. We pray for unity. We pray for strength in a time where things are getting a little bit difficult. We pray for church leaders. You have placed them there. We ask for their wisdom as well in this time, and for them to be surrounded by people who will pray for them faithfully also. Please bless our listeners, bless this country, bless our leaders, and let us go forth in your name. In Jesus' name, amen.
Oh, what an easy prayer to amen, Christine. Bless you.
It's how I do. It's how I do.
Hey, till we see you again, listeners. Bless you guys. Look forward to seeing some of you in the comments. Bring that flame war. Can't wait.
Yeah, absolutely. All right, ka kite anō.
God bless.